Good evening and welcome to this special meeting of the Melrose School Committee. This is March 21st, 2023, and I would like to do the call to order first. So I will go ahead and do that. Ms. Withy?
Here.
Mr. O'Connell?
Here.
Ms. McAndrew?
Here.
Ms. Rosie Thomas?
Here.
Ms. DeSalm?
Here.
Mayor Broder?
Here.
I am here, and the superintendent is not here this evening. And with that, I would state that we do have a quorum, and I would invite us to rise as we are able for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And I will note that this meeting is being recorded and televised by MMTV. So this evening, as I'm sure the community knows, we are at the point where the screening committee has made its deliberations and selections and have invited 3 individuals to join us on successive evenings. Tonight we are going to welcome Superintendent Tim Piwowar of the Billerica practicing public schools. We are very grateful for his being here after a long day, although as he noted earlier, superintendents do long days. That's what you do, so thank you for being so gracious. And I will make a couple of notes about how the format of this evening is going to go, so we all are sort of on the same page. I will invite Superintendent Piwowar to provide a minute or two of opening remarks. We will have a series of questions. The committee submitted questions of our own to Ms. Presser from MASC, who is our consultant this time, and she curated those for us and put them together, make sure there's no duplicates, things like that. And then Vice Chair O'Connell and I went through them just to make sure that we were filtering through a couple of lenses. One is that did we feel that the community's voice in your surveys was represented? And we felt that these questions did represent intentions and interests expressed by the community. The second thing that we did was to recall the superintendent and teacher evaluation rubric, which applies to any licensed educator in a district. And it was important to us that all 4 standards were represented: leadership, management and operations, family and community engagement, and professional culture, because ultimately the superintendent is evaluated on those standards as agreed upon relative to goals over a year by the committee and the superintendent. So we felt that that was a useful way to reflect the intentions of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts relative to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and in support of evolving and improving performance on behalf of the community and our student family. So that is how we arrived at these questions. So we will go through those. We have assigned those along the way. We have sort of some standards that we are going to explore, and I will be asking more questions than the rest of the committee. The committee has graciously offered to ask questions, so we will proceed in turn. There'll be about 4 minutes per question, and so we are looking at about an hour for our interview to be fair to all of our candidates. And we will invite you, Superintendent, to please start with an opening remark.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chair Driscoll, and thank you to members of the committee for inviting me here today. It's been a great day in Melrose, and I really appreciate the way that you've had an inclusive process today to really make sure that members across the community are represented and have had an opportunity to participate as part of this process. So just to talk a little bit about myself, my name is Tim Piwowar. I'm currently the superintendent of the Billerica Public Schools. I am not as I've said a few times today, I'm not a New Englander by native. I'm a native of Western New York, but came east and have been here since going to college. But coming out of college, I started in Billerica as a math teacher in 1997 at the high school. Loved the classroom, still miss the classroom. But at the same time, I realized that we get into this work as educators to do work on behalf of kids. And when the opportunity presented itself and somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, We think you'd be good at doing this thing called administration. And I realized that ultimately, while I might not have as much impact on any one individual student that I did with 100 or 120 that I had as a high school math teacher, the collective impact I could have across 5,000 students in our community was much greater. And sort of as I've taken different steps in my career, that's been a part of that process. So I worked as a high school math teacher for 8 years. I became our district's K-12 curriculum coordinator for math, science, and at the time health in 2005. Did that job until 2010, when I moved into central office in a role that was the Director of Information Systems and Accountability, essentially doing data, doing some of our reporting to that, while still sort of simultaneously wearing the math and science role. In 2011, after a turnover on our district leadership team, we reorganized, and I took a left-hand turn out of the curriculum realm and became the Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations. So I spent a year in the business office as we had an interim superintendent, and then at the end of that year applied for and became Superintendent in Billerica, position that I've held for the last 11 years since 2012. A really reasonable question to ask that I've been asked a few times today is why, after spending 26 years in one district, are you looking for potential change? And what I would say is that I'm at a point in my career where I'm looking for some different challenges. I'm at sort of an inflection point in my personal life with my oldest child going off to college. And I'm looking for a community that really is true to my core values. And I will say, and I'm sure it'll come up at different points in this interview, and I will say to the chair and members of the committee that if I go longer than 4 minutes, please feel free to cut me off because I get passionate about things.
I gotcha.
Yeah, appreciate that. But my most fundamental core value that I talk about constantly in our district is that we all have a fundamental responsibility for all of our kids, and all means all, no ifs, no ands, no buts, period. All means all. And so, knowing what I do about Melrose and having that confirmed as part of my visit today, it's really an opportunity to come here potentially, if I'm the selected candidate, and do some really great work on behalf of all kids as part of this district. And as I've said, I'm only about halfway through my career as superintendent. I've got at least another decade left, and I'm looking forward to coming to a place and trying to do some great things. And I think there's some real opportunity here to do that.
Thank you. We'll start with our first question. What are the characteristics of the Melrose Public Schools that you find attractive and compelling on the road to your next professional challenge? In other words, why Melrose and why now?
Yeah, so I think I started to. It's nice
I didn't
to
want
kind
to
of
speak for you.
Preempt some of that, I think. So just to expand upon that a little bit, right? I think that there was some, and there has been some really innovative work around personalized learning that's taken place here in Melrose about really, as I shared with the screening committee initially, as I shared as part of the public forum, the work that's happening around identifying, individual pathways for kids and doing goal setting, that's work that's part of our strategic plan in Billerica, but not, like the goal setting piece isn't until a couple of years from now. And just because we're in a different place there. And again, that aligns with that core focus and that goal around being for all kids. But the other thing it really aligns with, and I'll just talk about a second, core value, and I'm sure I'll get to the third one later through the questions, is that the most important thing we do, and we need to be aligned with our work in the instructional core, which is around students and teachers and content, and not the points on that triangle, but the lines that connect them. How do students relate to teachers? How do students relate to content? How do teachers relate to content? And how can I do work as a superintendent with my leadership team to support strengthening those bonds between those among those three entities, right? And so I think there was a lot of innovative work around that happening. I mean, certainly COVID disrupted everything, right? And we acknowledge that, but that can't be the excuse, and there's an ability to move forward. And I think that, some of the skill set that I have to be able to come in and build some relationships that will allow the district to potentially be able to move forward in some ways and building some community support for that while maintaining that history of educational excellence is something that's again, very exciting for me.
Thank you. Mr. O'Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Superintendent, I've heard you talk a lot about core values. I heard you talk about them in your engagement with the screening committee. You talked about them earlier this evening with the community meet and greet and in meeting with our community members who are participating in the METCO program. You talked about them. Could you lay them out for us and then talk with us a bit about how they are actually put into practice in your role as superintendent, if you would, please.
No, I appreciate it. And I mean, you have my resume as part of the pack, and I lay them out front and center at the front of the resume, because if we don't live and breathe by our core values, then what are we doing, right? So I talked about two of them already, that collective responsibility. We all have a responsibility for all of our kids, no ifs, no ands, no buts, period. The second one around the focus on the instructional core that I just spoke about, that's why schools exist, is for, it's ultimately about student learning, and that happens when they're presented with rigorous challenges and content, and with trusting relationships with teachers, and teachers need to know the content in order to be able to support that. The third one that I'll kind of expand upon a little bit more here, and I may be preempting some other questions by answering it, is around the importance of communication and collaboration. Nothing happens with people acting independently, and way more can happen when people come and work together. And one of the things that I'm really proud of that we've been able to accomplish in Billerica is developing a really strong, and acknowledging we're a different system of government, right? We're a town system of government as opposed to a city, but developing a really strong relationship with our municipal government, with our town manager, that's led to some, proudest moment in our career was this whole 2019 transition we went through, getting huge community support for a $176 million high school project with overwhelming support at the ballot box. Was really great. But that extends beyond just sort of those municipal relationships. It's how do you build that relationship with union leadership? I know that there have been some challenges here recently, but that comes from understanding each other's perspectives. And I've said this, I think, with every group that I've met with today. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got is when I was presented with a challenging situation where it kind of seemed like I had to pick a side. Don't think of it as a battle to be won or lost. Think of it as a problem to be solved. And that's something that I've really internalized and carried with me, because quite often when you get into the fight, you're more focused on winning than what the result is sometimes. And listen, I'm as competitive a guy as anybody else is. But in the role, we've got to remember that this is about kids. And so when we are able to get past some challenges of whether it's turf or territory or title, and really collaborate in a meaningful way together, then we can do great things on behalf of and for kids. So appreciate that.
Great, thank you.
My question is next. What is your experience in developing in-house special education programs in both the short term and long term? What have you done in your experience to try to make your special education department work better? And in your preliminary review of the Melrose Public Schools SPED programming, have you identified opportunities for immediate growth, and what are they?
So we've certainly done a lot of work in Billerica to try to increase our special education in-house programming. When I first became superintendent in 2012, we had north of 100 students on outside placements, around 110 or so. I don't remember the number exactly, but it's somewhere around there. That number is currently in the 60s. And so part of that was developing programming and constantly evolving that programming to be able to support students in districts. So, I can think about working to strengthen our learning adaptive behavior program, which was, which is for students that have significant social and emotional needs and associated behavioral challenges. I can think about the work that we've done to expand our Compass program, which has historically been for students with ASD on the autism spectrum. But at the same time, we also can't be complacent in program design because the needs of kids change, the numbers of kids change. It's probably not a secret if people out there in this community. I currently have an interim SPED director. She's the former superintendent here, Cindy Taymor, and I'm very happy to have Cindy come in as somebody that I've known for a long time and who I didn't mention this in my initial statements, not to out Cindy, but she has spoken glowingly about this district since. She and I started the induction program together in 2012 as new superintendents together. But we're going through a process right now to redesign our programs with a couple of goals in mind, because when I think about our ASD program, that population has grown to a level where it doesn't make sense that it should only exist in one building. And so we're now thinking about how do we, and looking to implement with two design goals in mind. One is how do we keep students as close to their home schools as possible? And two is how do we, is realizing that we should be grouping students based upon their identified area of need and instructional approach as opposed to just their diagnosis. Because you may have kids, with ASD that may present more behaviorally. You may have kids that may present needing more life skills type programming. And so we need to be responsive to that. So that's some of the work that we've done. I will say that while the primary focus about developing programming is about having the ability to service kids in the least restricted environment, keeping them close to their peers, and really be able to build programming in a way that supports those kids, there are residual and beneficial impacts to doing that from a financial perspective too, because I realize that's another part of the equation. And one of the things that I was really fortunate to be able to do, and speaking about collaboration and consultation with our town manager and really developing a 5-year fiscal plan for funding it, the savings that we realized back in about 2014 from developing some in-district programming, bringing kids back in district, we then used over a 5-year plan with support from some free cash funding and some of our circuit breaker reserves to move from half-day tuition-based kindergarten to free full-day kindergarten in the district, which was a game changer for families because we saw the impact of those families that could afford full-day K and those that couldn't. And so, again, while the primary driver for building programming is about supporting kids, there are other benefits to doing that work as well, too, in terms of what that allows the district to do as a whole with the resources that it has, knowing that they're limited. So,
Madam Chair, one quick question. It's very short clarifying. How many students in the Tewksbury Public Schools?
In Billerica?
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
No.
I can't answer the Tewksbury question for you. I'm sorry. So we're between 48 and 4,900.
Very good. Ms. Withy.
Thank you. So the City of Melrose motto is one community, open to all. Given the recent turmoil in public education and the increasing politicization of education nationwide, what's your approach as a school leader with regards to equity, inclusion, and diversity within a school community, while also being mindful of cultural tensions between tradition and change?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. And I think ultimately it is about if we stay true to that core value that we all, and listen, I've already said it 3 times tonight, so you know that I live and breathe it, right? We all have a collective responsibility for all of our kids, no ifs, no ands, no buts. Then really, you know, the approach to work in DEI is about creating a sense of belonging for every student. And that some of that is looking at structures and whether or not there are structures. I know that, you know, I will say it's been a little bit more challenging to get that work off the ground in the community where I currently work, but I'm happy that it is one of the 4 key components of the strategic plan that we just developed and the committee approved back this fall. And I want to give a ton of credit and thanks to, you know, we had we call it racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. We use the READY acronym in Billerica. Credit to the members of the working group where we brought in some parents that were not historically represented at the table for those conversations. We had 4 amazing students as part of that group, 2 seniors, 2 juniors, one of whom who just provided such insight from the student perspective that they've agreed to come back and be part of our standing district ready team. Even though they're off at college this year, they're still coming back and participating remotely because, and I will say I reached out to them individually because their viewpoint was so valued and important that I wanted to make sure that that was continued. And so, you know, some things that came out of that conversation were, for example, looking at how our course selection process works and whether or not, you know, families that have been around and know how to work the system get advantages that families that are new to the community, right? Those are some structural things. I think there's also work around training staff around things like implicit bias and then living and breathing that in the work that we do. And, you know, the piece about cultural resistance, it's very real and it's going to exist in different communities and it's going to exist in different levels in different communities. And I think I said this in the screening interview and I just said it with another group recently. I will take slings and arrows from adults if it's about protecting and supporting kids. That's who we live for. At the same time, that becomes much easier and better to do when there are other adults in the community that support that. Starting with the school committee, starting with members of the community that stand up, city council, you know, whomever that is. It's the same logic that applies that we teach kids about how to stand up to bullying in schools, about being upstanders. It applies in the course of civil discourse around these issues. And there's a saying I say a lot, and I've said a couple of times today, and listen, and I realize we're televised, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's very true. And I said it in public forums in plenty of cases. Adults are just kids in bigger bodies that are more stubborn. And so we know what works with kids, and when it comes to these issues and people are trying to thwart a sense of inclusivity and belonging, so why wouldn't we engage in those same behaviors as being upstanding as adults?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Can you talk to us, please, about your approach to communication with the school committee, the district's administrators, the faculty and staff, and importantly, the community at large, including all residents, not just school families and caregivers, along with the local business community and our nonprofit and cultural sector?
So, I mean, I think that initially starts, if I were the selected candidate and came in, that starts with my entry planning process, and that's having a whole lot of conversations, one-on-one, multi-on-one, whatever that is, and asking some initial questions around essentially a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths in the district? What are the challenges in the district? What are the opportunities in the district? And what are those things, as opposed to, I don't like saying threats, what are those things that are really important that we want to protect and maintain? Because you don't want to, if there are things that are part of cultural norms that you need to know that, right? And part of that would be working with the committee and with other members of the admin team to figure out, I might have a preconceived list of who I need to speak with, but there may be other players in the community in different capacities that I wouldn't necessarily know coming in that I would need to have those conversations with. So it starts there, and it starts having that face time and being somebody who's not just the person who sends out memos and then leaves the robocall on snow days, but the person that's actually out there and visible, whether that is, holding things like, and I'm going to acknowledge, right, that COVID disrupted some of these community kind of events too. But whether that's holding, forums, for the coffees for the community or for parents, whether that's being out at the ball fields or the plays or the robotics competitions or the elementary choral concerts, whatever. I mean, there's a level of that visibility that's important to at least set the groundwork for effective communication. That being said, when things need to be communicated, it's important, and I've talked about this with the admin team earlier today, it's important that we know what we're communicating and why we're communicating and how that relates to the work that we're doing. So having a coherent strategy that we can point to when there may be pushback about something we're trying to do and saying that we're doing this because this aligns with our strategy and our approach as a district, and that if you have, and always offering up the opportunity if people want to come in and have a conversation. I'm not a huge fan of when there's a challenge going back and forth over email once or twice. After that, come on and let's talk, because you get a lot more accomplished that way than not. The broader business community, right? I think that there needs to be, or the community as a whole, right? I think some of that starts with the communication collaboration with the city council. I had the opportunity this morning to do a driving tour as well with, and I don't remember exactly her title, but the economic development person, and was kind of probing her around some of the approaches to economic development in the city, because I think that's important. Because ultimately, when it comes to providing resources for kids, whether that's through building business partnerships and having, whether they become I mentioned robotics, mentors for the robotics team, or they're providing funding for this program through some level of philanthropy, or if that becomes understanding how growing the tax revenue base in the community is going to help grow this percentage, is going to help grow the pie that then flows directly to kids and the work that we do for students. Those are all really important conversations to have. And so, whether it's community forums, I mean, it's the email blasts. I mean, social media is, I think, the bane of so many of our existences. But we use it because it's a way to get messages out quickly. We don't go, I mean, I will tell you personally, I don't go back and forth because I don't think there's a whole lot of benefit that happens when you do that. But it's partly figuring out where the people are and how to get the messages to them in that way. But as much of it as can be sort of, old-fashioned hitting the pavement FaceTime as possible, so that it's not a one-way street of communication, but that it's two-way and people can feel valued and their voices can be actually heard and listened to. And while we may not always agree on where we're going, to at least be able to explain that here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. So I think that's, may have been more than 4 minutes, but that's...
No, you're spot on.
I tend to talk a little bit fast too, so...
Yeah, you're good on time,
Okay,
so.
thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Sohn.
Thank you. Welcome again.
Thank you.
My question, please share a challenging professional situation you have faced as superintendent of schools and how you have handled that situation. For instance, why you made the decisions that you did, whether you anticipated or gauged their popularity or unpopularity, how you dealt with the public reaction, either way, and whether, given the public response, you would, in hindsight, make the same decision again.
It's a good question. I've been doing this a long time, so I can think of a number of different things that are popping to mind initially. And so I'm thinking about what story I want to, because ultimately, I mean, you can make difficult decisions about adults all day long, but I'm trying to think of what the right story may be that is more about kids, right? Because that's well, so let's just go there, right? I mean, there's a very public conversation in our community throughout the course of this year around whether or not we were going to be extending the length of the student day. I'm not saying anything that's out of school, because we had news cameras at our school committee meeting where this was ultimately decided. We had worked to put together, we reached a successful collective bargaining agreement with our teacher and paraprofessional unions that extended their workdays so that we could add time to the student day on behalf of kids. Ultimately, when push came to shove, the committee decided not to implement that longer day in a vote that they took a couple of weeks ago, and now we're trying to figure out what our next steps are. And so that's going to be some of the work that I need to do with our team around that, because we're sort of continuing with our current status quo. What I would say is that there, I shared this with the screening committee. There is probably some additional work that I could have and should have done with the committee initially, across all members of the committee, realizing the conversations that are had in negotiations are not public versus conversations that are out there are more public. And so are there some things I would have done again? Sure. But the ultimate goal of trying to fight for what's best for kids, I'm never going to back down from that, ever. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Rosa Thomas.
Sure. Please share your thinking about an approach to engaging both the school community and, more importantly, the wider community around the annual school budget, specifically and around public education finances generally.
Yeah, so, I mean, the number one word when you're talking around finances and budget is about trust, and honestly, cooperation, right? So when I think about the approach that we've taken, whether that's on the operating budget side, or I talked before about the high school project we did and trying to get a debt exclusion passed, numbers are only as good as the story that you tell with them. And that story that you tell needs to be aligned again with your values and your direction of where you're trying to head as a district. And so, when I think about our budget process, while we go through kind of the process that everybody does, where I bring my principals in, we have conversations internally around sort of what's there, what the wishes are, what the wants are, and then we meet, I have a budget subcommittee that we meet to prioritize that. The other work that happens simultaneously is, as I talked about the relationship I have with the town manager, we work behind the scenes to kind of figure out, what, given the direction he has from our select board, and sort of where we can push and pull to identify a right number so that from day one publicly we come out with the same figure. That wasn't always the case in Billerica where I am, but what happens is when the school committee comes out with one number and the town manager and the select board come out with a different number, then you're asking the citizens of the community to try to put values on which is more important, teachers or police officers. And nobody wins when that's a conversation you're asking the community to have. And so there have been some times where, because we built that relationship, the town manager may take a little less to give a little more because we have a pressing need, or we may take a little less to give a little more because they have a more pressing need. But so I'll give you an example of something, and I appreciate John as our town manager, and I know he wrote a letter that's in your packet as well too. I think about, when you talk about building community support and working strategically to do that. So about 2016-17, we were having a lot of conversations about the opioid crisis. And how it was hitting our community, and understanding the multiple pillars of approach to that when it comes to education and prevention and enforcement. And so I was sitting in a meeting with me, my assistant superintendent, our police chief, the town manager, assistant town manager, trying to figure out what we could do. And I talked about, on the school side, starting really young. One of the things that we were missing is we didn't have elementary health teachers. We kind of left the teaching of health curriculum to classroom teachers who had different levels of expertise, had different levels of time and attention they put to it, and it wasn't really a coordinated, concerted effort. When in that conversation, basically the town manager said, this is too important not to do, asked how much would it cost. I said at the time it was roughly $250,000, $300,000, whatever it was. Wound up being $300,000 because we rolled that in with a townwide substance abuse prevention coordinator. Identified a separate warrant article through our town, again, different governmental structure, but separate warrant article through our town meeting to fund this. When I talk about the importance of having one voice, I got up, police chief got up, town manager got up and said, this is the single most important thing that you're voting on at this town meeting. And again, it's a separate raise and appropriate article specifically just for this. Community behind it with overwhelming support, and that's been built into our operating budget going forward. So
That's terrific. I am really excited to hear more about that. I'm also concerned just because, we don't want to be having separate private behind-the-scenes deals. Like, how do you do what you've been doing in Bellrico without it becoming seen as, oh, you're having an agreement with the business town manager, you guys are running the show, you decide behind the scenes. That can be seen as not transparent. So how do you make sure that it's an inclusive process?
Yeah, so what I would say is there's a difference between agreeing on the number and agreeing on what makes up that number, right? So in terms of agreeing on the number, that is, I have guidance from the school committee, the town manager has guidance from the select board. We're both charged independently with identifying at least a bottom line budget number that meets those guidelines. And that's the work that we do, because that's our jobs in the governmental structure that we have. But when it comes to what is part of that budget, right? And I will say that I've been there 11 years. Every year we have wound up having to take less than what a level services budget is. It's just kind of the nature of the financial climate that we're in. And that kind of is what it is. But as part of that process, so we have budget subcommittee meetings. They're open to the public. We're inclusive in that process. We talk about, we give budget updates at the school committee meeting that says, here's the work that we've done so far. Here's the cuts that we're considering incorporating. Here's the ads we're considering incorporating and why, and how that relates to the strategic process, the strategic plan that we have, or shifting demographic trends, whatever that need is. And then again, as a town, we have our vetting process through our finance committee, and ultimately it's, our town meeting is the one that decides up or down on our school budget. So I've got to present that too. We have a representative town meeting, 240 elected representatives. Not every seat gets filled, but that's part of that public vetting process too. And again, some of that may just be differences in format of government. But that initial number, again, is just a number. It's not listen, I'm a Polish guy, so it's not what goes into the sausage. It's just the casing around it. What goes into the sausage is what happens through that public conversation. I can't believe I just used that analogy in a public forum in a public
That's
interview,
awesome,
but
though.
it's what came to mind.
That'll keep everyone awake
Yeah, exactly.
while we talk about educational
Yeah.
budgeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you please, you talked about this a little bit, but could you share your experience with collective bargaining with specific regard to contract negotiations, grievances, and labor management relations generally?
Yeah, so I've been doing this 11 years, 12 if you count the year in the business office where I've been part of contract negotiations directly. I will say that when I was a curriculum coordinator, I was actually an officer for our administrators union, so I sat on the other side of the table back then. That didn't come out earlier today, but I figure I should at least share that in the interest of full transparency. I'm proud to say that in 12 years of doing this, I've never had a contract even reach mediation, let alone, steps further along the process. And part of that is making sure that there are really well-developed working relationships with union leadership that don't start when you get at the contract table, you get at the main table for negotiations, but happen throughout. I've had a number of different, I've had 3 different teacher union presidents. in the 11 years I've been doing this. All of them, I will go and have I'll get out of my office, I'll go over to their school. If there's something that's brewing, I'll have a conversation with them face to face. We'll talk, we'll text, because I don't believe in gotchas. And that some of that is not necessarily related to the contract negotiations, but some of that's related to grievances or personnel management. So that's I think having those pre-established relationships, and going back to the thing that I said before about don't think of it as a battle to be won or lost, think of it as a problem to be solved, is something I believe is really, really true as it relates to union negotiations. I think when it comes to settling contracts, right, there is what can happen is that there is a sense of each side not necessarily seeing the other's perspective that can get in the way. And I think it's important to try to create a culture at the table where that's really demonstrated. And so what I mean by that is, so I can think about times in collective bargaining when there have been asks that have come that I need to explain, or let me rephrase that, where I wind up explaining what that ask, here's the residual impact of that and what that means. And that means that we were going to have to make cuts in these areas because we only have this amount of allocation. Or that this is, the community has said that this is a red line that we can't cross, and while I understand that need or that want, we're not able to go there. I think at the same time, it's part of my job on the management side for negotiations to understand that the union has an obligation to their membership, and they need to show that they're fighting, and they need to show wins. But ultimately, my job still comes back to being around protecting resources for kids. So honestly, there's some conversations around optics that happen, and I don't care if the union can sell a win if it means that we're ultimately getting a result that's good for kids. And that sometimes has to do with how things are phrased or how things are communicated, because work on behalf of kids only happens when you have educators in classrooms that are engaged in doing that work for kids and are in a place where everybody in that room, students and adults, feel supported. But at the same time, we also need to be aware of the actual real constraints that are out there. And knowing that if we settle terms that are unsustainable, that's ultimately going to mean a negative impact on kids and a negative impact on working conditions for staff. I may be kind of nuancing a little bit too much here in this, and so my apologies for anybody that may be watching that's not well versed in contract negotiations and may not be able to read through some of the lines that I'm trying to present here. But I think what it comes down to is you want to build a culture of respect where, while we may not always agree, because there's never going to be a situation where we always agree, we at least can understand from each other's perspective why we don't agree, and that hopefully we can live to move on to have a conversation another day. So, thank you.
Ms. McKinney.
Thank you. Thank you, Superintendent Piwowar, for being here in Melrose and for being with us tonight. My question is, what do you love about working with students, and how do you stay in touch with them at all levels and elevate their ideas and their voices?
So what I love about working with kids is as you've heard me say multiple, that's why we're here. And I think back to when, I went to college. I was originally going to be a computer programmer, and then I wound up becoming a theoretical math major and no idea what I was going to do with that. And started teaching SAT prep, my sophomore year in college, started teaching SAT prep classes the weekend to kids from Cambridge, Ridge, and Latin to make a little money, and just fell in love with sort of that aha experience. That glimmer in the eye when somebody's figured something out that isn't there before. And I'm like, I want more of that. And so that kind of led me on my teaching path, and why it was tough to leave the classroom, and still, why there are times when, and I haven't done it for a couple of years now, and actually I'll tell you a story about this. A couple of years ago, I was actually talking about union relationships. The grievance chair of our union, who I used to teach next door to as a math teacher. So it was nice to have that relationship. So I substitute taught for her for a day. She was going to be out. I went in. And I discovered, by the way, I rediscovered the importance of relationships. Like her AP Calc kids, I could have done anything and they would have been there because they loved the math part. Some of the other kids were like, who is this guy and what's he trying to make us actually do work for? You're a sub, I'm supposed to just kind of sit there. So that just kind of reestablished that relationship importance, right? But it is seeing that growth in kids, seeing those moments that are just so awesome. And that comes from being in classrooms. That comes from doing learning walks in elementary schools and getting down on the floor with kids and asking them about the story they're writing or the book that they're reading. I talked about being out in events and seeing kids in those other formats before. And it's just that feeling you get here. That's why we do the work that we do. And so, like I said, I still miss being in the classroom. And I still see my job as an educator, clearly, right? I'm just, educating adults more than I'm educating kids. And I'll go back to my previous statement about adults. But it's, it's about seeing kids grow and be able to see what they can become that is just inspiring and wonderful.
Thank you. And if I could just touch on the second part again, just how do
Sure.
you work to elevate student voices in decision-making?
Okay, yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I'll say that I talked about our strategic plan we just developed, and while that's not one of the 4 themes, that's actually, instead of grouping them by themes, we kind of group them by common interest in our plan. And so student voice is one of those common areas within our strategic plan. I talked about before our District's Ready work and having student voice be part of that process. That's across the board with us. We had students on our steering committee for our strategic plan, students on all 4 of our working groups. I've been blessed to have some phenomenal student reps at our school committee, including one of whom was elected to the State Board of Ed a couple of years ago. And in good fashion, pushed back on the commissioner a couple of times. Because he was certainly not afraid to share and speak his voice. So I encourage principals to do the same, right? One of the things that I'm really happy that we did, even though our elementaries are now K to 4, so our kids are not as old as they used to be. But we have student government councils in our K to 4 schools. So even starting at that early age within the school process to have that voice be a part. One place that we're not there yet, but we're just starting to implement as part of our strategic plan, is doing things like school climate surveys. The state does one, but they kind of give it right after kids take MCAS, which is not the best time to ask kids how they feel about school. So that's something we haven't implemented yet, just we haven't had the budget for it, but that's part of we're piloting right now and looking to implement for next year. But that's the start of a conversation. That's designed to help identify what are some things that we're not seeing as we're having conversations, and where does that ask us to probe deeper, whether that's through focus groups or whatever it is. So it kind of speaks generally about our approach to student, or my approach to student voice.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What has been your experience with building district budgets and overseeing how monies are spent and accounted for? In this regard, please share your view of the role of the superintendent in relation to budget development, management of expenditures, and accounting and reporting on an ongoing basis.
So, yeah, I got asked a very similar question in the community forum earlier, and I'll give the same answer I gave then, which is ultimately the buck stops here. I'm the superintendent, and I need to have enough oversight over what happens on the financial side to make sure that funds are spent in an appropriate way that are consistent with the budget and consistent with the goals of the district. I do have the benefit of having spent a year in the business office, so sort of from a technical side, while I may not have the same level of robust developed skill set that a really seasoned business official would have, I certainly know my way around Munis enough to be able to kind of see what's going on. And then just in terms of even controls, and we've established this for a long time, while my director of finance and operations is generally the one that will approve purchase orders when they're put in, anything over $1,000 has to go to my desk for approval. Not that I'm sitting there poring over every PO, but just from a control perspective, that's there where I'll go in. And if there's something that looks a little bit fishy, my director of finance operations will normally catch it. And fishy is too strong of a word, right? But if there's something that seems like a large expenditure that may have a question mark around it. So those are just like some controls that we've put in place. We do monthly reporting to the school committee in the year, in budget cycle, where we present our actuals, our encumbrances, our projections. This time of year, if you actually were to look at our public budget summary, it looks like we're in the red, but that's because the last thing we do is we transfer circuit breaker over. So, we're, every year we're certainly there, within budget. And there are some challenging years that happen, but that's why you need to make sure that from a budget building perspective, you need to build in some reserves and contingencies. So coming back to the special ed question, when I came in 2012, we had basically nothing left in our circuit breaker account, and I realized that there are some challenges right now because of, in terms of rollover, because of some challenges that happened fiscally here. So we worked hard as we went through the budget process, knowing that if you don't have if you don't have contingency plans, and you have unexpected expenses, which can happen at any time, and you get caught short and you have to go to the town asking for more money, or the city for more money, particularly if it's again, your trust is gone. And so that sometimes means having to sacrifice some things you want to do up front because you want to make sure that you have buffers built in. But that's okay. Because it means that, it doesn't mean that it's gone away, it means that it may need to be delayed a year until you're in a better financial situation. But that's a really important part of the process. And so being conservative on how we estimate circuit breaker receipts, based upon whether or not it's our actual expenditures, or based upon what we're expecting for reimbursement from the state, whether it's on the tuition side or on the transportation side. That relates to whether it's looking at, utilities contracts or transportation contracts that may not be fully bid by the time you've got to finalize the budget, and making some conservative projections on escalating costs that are not going to, leave you short when push comes to shove. I think that's part of the budget building process that works to make sure that you are able to move forward in a way that builds that support. And then if you are able to have some reserves built in, right? There need to be some tough decisions on day one. And then I will say it was great to see the level of Chapter 78 that's coming from Melrose, right? And that will, I will tell you, I work in a district, we are a minimum aid district, and will continue to be for a long time because we lost a ton of enrollment over the span of 20 years. And so that's the opportunity to hopefully fill some of those gaps and fill some of those coffers back up again and continue to move forward. And that should hopefully continue to be sustainable over the next few years as SOA gets fully implemented. But that's been some of my approaches. I haven't had sort of an increasing Chapter 70 amount. We get $30 a kid every year. We got 60 last year, but that's $340,000 on a 60, that's a drop in it's 0.5% of our budget is what we're getting for Chapter 70 increase. So we've had to, use some other approaches like I talked about to make sure we build a conservative budget that's responsive to the needs we need to have.
Thank you. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Superintendent, thank you for being here. Thank you for spending the day with us. I think it is a long process. I came in at the end, to the community conversation. Glad we have that opportunity to meet as well. So, kind of a broad-based question. You can really just run with it. Is what makes a successful superintendent? And I'm really focusing on building trust within the community. It's to a certain degree, we are in soft competition, right, with private schools, with charter schools and things like that, but we also need to build the confidence to our customers that we are doing a good job. And there's a little bit of politics and professionalism in that. I'm also wondering, part of what you mentioned makes me want to ask a little bit more, which is, how do you balance immediate need versus long-term planning? And of course, if you answer this, you should get the Nobel Prize, not worrying about
Yeah.
being the next superintendent.
Yeah, so let me try to take the last part of that first. It depends on what kind of long-range planning you're, right? There's a difference between capital planning and operating planning, right? And, you know, I haven't really talked about our whole transition with the high school project and everything else, but that started by developing a 10-year long-range capital plan that we went out and just sold over the span of years leading up to that high school project for why we needed to get there. So, and so, I mean, that's real long range. Like right now, we're doing a new 10-year master plan that the slowest option has us, you know, doing a building project that's going to open in 2080. That's not my preferred option, but that, you know, that's a real long range
Thinking
planning.
about it that way.
So at the same time, balancing immediate needs, right? It depends on, first of all, what makes it immediate. Immediate needs about kids take priority over about immediate needs about adults. Just staying true to that value. But at the same time, what's the prioritization process? Who decides that? Knowing that ultimately, you know, those expenditures, school committee, I mean, has the statutory piece on that, but would hopefully rely heavily on my recommendation and the recommendation of the business office to support that. But that's again why you try to build contingencies in so that when those immediate needs pop up, you're able to triage now and then address later. In terms of that trust piece, again, it's about, partly it's about the politicking and being out and being present and shaking hands and having those conversations. I will say, you know, when you talked about being in a soft competition with private schools and charter schools, you know, it is not just that, it's other educational options for kids, right? Whether it's through school choice or growing in some districts and is homeschooling. But I'll also mention it's a much harder competition rather than a soft competition for staff. And, you know, there is I referred to last year's hiring season was the hardest I've ever seen. You know, we had about a dozen staff members resign in August to go take jobs in other districts, and that was happening all over the state. I referred to it as the Hunger Games last year because that's really what was happening. And so there is that part of the equation too. And so when it comes to building trust and selling the community simultaneously, right? That starts with that entry plan process. And I shared my core values, and I said I think those values are aligned with from what I know with what Melrose believes, but I won't know that until I come in and really go through that entry planning process, hear the feedback from the community, ultimately present those findings to this committee, who then says, yes, you know, that's reflective of what we're hearing too, and ultimately having a cohesive strategy with clear benchmarks and indicators that's saying, this is Melrose, this is what we stand for, this is where we're going, these are the actions that we're going to take to get there. And then we better put our money where our mouth is and make sure that we actually live true to those things that we say we're going to do. The last thing in the world that anybody ever wants to do is overpromise and underdeliver. You know, if that means that sometimes I need to soft sell what we're able to do and underpromise and then wind up over-delivering, and then letting it, whether it's the committee or the union or whomever it is, be the hero, I don't care about the credit. I care about the work being done, and I care about building the support. That's fine. But it's having a cohesive plan, having everybody on board with that plan. You know, I talked with the leadership team today. You know, we need to be able to speak with one voice collectively. And I say this all the time to my own staff. If I say one thing and my principal says a different thing to their staff, they're going to listen to their principal 10 times out of 10 because that's the person they have to face every day of the week. It's not me. That's the person they have to face when they sign into the office. So it's first about making sure that internally we have a consistent message and we repeat that message over and over and over again. The same way I talked about my core value, if we all have collective responsibility for all of our kids. It's repeating that message, saying what we're going to do about it, and then we better be held accountable for actually doing that. So.
Perfect, thank you.
Last question.
Sure.
Could you please describe your vision of a high-functioning professional culture in school buildings and how, depending on your assessment of a starting point, you embed practices that evolve into or maintain that high-functioning culture?
Yeah, so if we're talking in the context of schools, because I think that's obviously where sport is sort of like the Harvard Business Review about professional culture. But if we're talking about the context of positive cultures in schools, it means that we all believe that the decisions we make are centered and focused around kids. That's number one, and that everyone can articulate that while there may be things that we disagree about why that happens. Or there may be things we disagree about what the decisions are made, because we may have different perspectives around what's best for kids. That ultimately we understand. There's an understanding that that's why we're there. I think the other thing is there has to, in terms of having a positive culture, there has to be an opportunity for healthy disagreement. And I have said this multiple times today. I will say it again. Is I want to be, and it's part of my core value around collaboration. I try not to do anything in isolation, and I want to be surrounded by people that tell me I'm full of it when I need to be told. Because if everybody has blind spots, and myself included. And so I need to make sure that if the it that I think is right is way off base, I need to have somebody who has a different perspective around me that's willing to tell me that. And from parent to paraprofessional to teacher to assistant principal to central office staff. Means I get yelled at sometimes, and that's fine. We all get, unless you guys are school committee members, you guys get yelled at sometimes too. But that's, but I think, but if we can have that disagreement, but then come out of that room coming back to what our core value and our strategy is and be on the same page, that's a healthy culture. And I mentioned this upstairs too, and it's a culture where there is joy in the work and there's joy in with kids. I talked about some of the work that I do with my leadership team around, icebreakers, and some icebreakers, and we don't do trust falls, right? Trust falls is the one that nobody ever wants to do, and for understandable reasons. But those are those kinds of in-between moments that build that kind of culture and support for one another. Listen, I shared this with the admin team, and I realize we're running out of time, so maybe I shouldn't share the story, but I will anyway.
Right ahead.
Our first summer leadership retreat after, I forget whether it was 2020 or 2020, one of the COVID years, right? Like my principals, my AP, my coordinators, they were spent, and understandably so. And we get together for 2 full days in August, and to kind of talk about our direction, how we align the work that we're doing in classrooms with our strategy, and having a through line from, I just had to slide this in, having a through line from our district strategy to our school improvement plans to our evaluation process to make sure that they're all aligned. But they needed to do something else. And so I said, here's what we're going to do. And I'm giving away some secrets, and if somebody wants to steal this, that's fine. I gave everybody 2 half sheets of paper. And I said, you're going to write down a question, and I want it to be as ridiculous a question as you want to. And the example I gave is, would you rather have an awful mother-in-law or an awful daughter-in-law? And don't think too hard about that one. You could say father-in-law or something, whatever it is. So write down 2 ridiculous questions. They had them on the paper. I said, okay, crumple them up into a ball. And we met in the town hall auditorium. All right, that's where my office is in town hall. We're in the our town hall is an old school. They crumpled up, and we had a snowball fight in the middle of town hall. We're throwing crumpled pieces of paper at each other, and at the end of and I would yell stop after a couple of minutes, and people were laughing, and there was joy in the room. And I yelled stop, and I said, okay, whatever piece of paper is at your feet, pick it up, find a person next to you, and ask them that question, whatever it is. And so we did that for like 10, 15 minutes. And it was just such a release for the folks in that room that had been through so much, and was an opportunity to kind of, go back to being human again. So that when we sat, we had to do some really hard work when we got together today. We talk about building a culture. If it takes 15 minutes of that kind of an activity to build a cohesive team that can work together, I probably wouldn't introduce that on day one here. I just like that comes after having some established, norms and relationships with one another. That's a healthy culture with each other, because then we can, as I've said numerous times today, if we can laugh together, then we can cry together during the hard times too. So,
Thank you. And that ends our list of questions, so I would invite you to make a closing statement.
sure. So thank you, Chair Driscoll, and thank you all the members of the school committee for having me here tonight. It's really been a pleasure and an honor spending the day here in Melrose. As I said in my opening statement, I'm excited about the possibility of coming here and being the superintendent. I met so many wonderful and great people today, and appreciate the process that you went through to invite staff and members of the community to be part of the day today. I would just say that it is refreshing and encouraging to have these kinds of conversations in a public forum, to be able to talk about kids and about how we really support all kids. And it has been as you said, Chair Driscoll, in your introduction, superintendents are used to long days, but I'm happy to say that I'm leaving here at 8:30 tonight as invigorated as I was when I walked in the door at 8:30 this morning. So I want to thank you all for that. I want to thank the members of the community that are here behind me and the public as well too, and everybody came out during the course of the day. I really appreciate it, and I know you guys have a decision to make, but I certainly appreciate the time and thoughtfulness that you've put into that process. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I just want to remind everybody that we are very actively seeking opinions from you. So on the Melrose Public Schools Superintendent Search site, part of the Melrose Public Schools website, there is a Survey Monkey link that Ms. Presser has provided to us, and she is collecting all of that information. She's going to share that out at the end of our process and let us know what you think. So please take advantage of that and let us know. We're very excited to learn from you what you're hearing and what you're thinking and what you're feeling. So please go ahead and do that, and we will be very grateful for that. And with that, we have concluded our agenda, and I would invite a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Made by Mayor Broder,
Second.
seconded by Mr. O'Connell, with no discussion. All in favor? Opposed? That motion carries unanimously, and we are adjourned. Good evening and welcome to the Melrose School Committee meeting of March 22nd. This is a special meeting. And with that, welcome. Let me call the roll, please. Dory Withy is absent this evening. Ed O'Connell.
Here.
Ms. McAndrew.
Here?
Ms. Rosie Thomas.
Here.
Ms. DeSelm.
Here.
Mayor Broder.
Here.
And I am here. The superintendent is not available this evening. And with that, we have a quorum of 6 members present. Therefore, we may begin. Please rise as you are able, and we'll say the pledge.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And a note, this meeting is being recorded and televised by MMTV. So we thank them as always. This evening, we have one agenda item. We are here to introduce and welcome Interim Superintendent of the Milton Public Schools, Garth McKinney. Welcome, glad you are here. We will be asking some questions and proceeding with beginning with an opening statement, some questions, and a closing statement. And I just would like to remind the community that the way that we've crafted these questions, we have filtered them through 2 main lenses, one being the survey information and other communications from the community. What would the community like to hear from you? And the second is through the lens of the evaluation rubric, certainly the superintendent evaluation rubric, which is certainly followed in different ways, of course, by all educators in the district and every district in the Commonwealth. But we wanted to ensure that we covered the 4 standards of leadership, management on operations, family and community engagement, and professional culture, because that is ultimately what our superintendent is evaluating evaluated on, certainly based on the goals that we would mutually agree to. But if that's the way that the Commonwealth has us doing this, we want to make sure that we are thoughtfully and carefully aligned, and we felt that crafting questions that would do that might be supportive of this work. So I will invite you to please speak to us a little bit, and then we'll get into some questions.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me tonight and for the day, really spending time in the schools and getting a tour of the city and getting to know the inner workings of Melrose. It's really been a nice visit. So I'm Garth McKinney. I've been in public education 26 years. I'm currently serving as the interim superintendent in the Milton Public Schools. Prior to that, I served as the interim superintendent in the Nashua School District and also the assistant superintendent in the Nashua School District. I have 10 years experience in New Hampshire, and before that, 16 years of experience in Massachusetts in a variety of roles. I started in the classroom, worked my way into administration, principal, assistant principal, department head, solid background in literacy. I was a literacy coach, a reading specialist, a Title I tutor, really helped a lot of kids with early literacy skills in K-8, helped them with transitioning in terms of the high school and putting reading interventions in place both in the middle school level and the high school level. And then I've also taught courses at the graduate and undergraduate level. I'm here to talk about my experience, and I think I have some skills that are a match to the need here in Melrose in terms of working on budget and fiscal controls, dealing with complex problems and resolving them, being a clear communicator and ambassador for the schools, building trust across the community, and solving personnel issues with an HR background that I have in terms of labor management, personnel issues, and recruiting and retaining staff, which is really key coming out of post-COVID, that we staff our schools correctly so kids get everything they need. So that's what brings me here and who I am.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Mr. O'Connell to lead us off this evening.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being with us, Dr. McKinney. What are the characteristics of the Melrose Public Schools that you find attractive and compelling on the road to your next professional challenge? In other words, why Melrose and why now?
So a lot of the things that are in place in Melrose resonate with me and the work that I've done in the past around some transformative work in education, from personalized learning, UDL, restorative practices, equity work, transforming from traditional grading to standards-based grading or competencies, and also navigating the equity work that's key to all the other work happening across the district. The world's becoming a more diverse place, and I think our job is to provide access and opportunity for all kids to achieve at a higher level. It's a really nice community that's historically been supportive of the schools. You have a supportive school committee and a city that wants the best for its schools. It's an attractive community to go to in terms of a balance between outdoor recreational spaces, dining, and other things. So it's a nice community to go to. And I'd like to, do the superintendency for once really well. And this, I think, is a really good match in terms of what it has to offer, but also some of the skills that I have in terms of, like I spoke, those 5 things, but also leading during challenging times, managing complex problems, resolving conflicts, ensuring that, you're communicating in positive and productive ways to the community so they know what's going on, but also in terms of crisis, that you're managing those effectively so people feel like they're in the know and what's going on. So the question of why, that would be some of the main reasons why.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Mayor.
Doctor, thank you again for coming. Folks should understand that this is the end of a long day for each of the candidates. It involves visiting with administration and teachers, a lot of different stakeholders. So I just hope folks understand that this is kind of the end of the day, not the beginning of the day for you. We're very grateful for the time and attention that you've put in. So I'm hoping you can share with us essentially your core values. What is it that kind of makes you tick in terms of education? What are you grounded in? And how would that manifest itself or be practiced in the superintendent role?
I think I talked in my journey today around being firm and fair, and I think those are good things both as a parent and a teacher, that we understand what the expectations are, and we do everything to help and support kids, and we provide fair and equitable access to all the resources necessary so everybody can be successful. I believe in being really transparent and sharing as much as possible within the confines of policy and law and confidentiality and all the things that go on. People should know about the good things that are going on in a school and some of the challenges. I see the superintendency as the chief ambassador and cheerleader for the district, so I'm not afraid to go and meet with people. I visit schools every week. I think visibility brings credibility, and if you know what's going on and you're in schools and people know you know them, they know your name, and they can approach you and share what's going on without, concern, it's a valuable asset. I think keeping the lines of communication open are really important, both with parents, teachers and students, but also here, City Hall, like it's city dependent in Nashua, working together with city officials to provide the very best education possible, because that's an investment in the entire community. And when people look at a community, they're invested in the schools. I know why I picked where I live is because of the great schools and opportunities that happen there. Some of the other things about me, I'm a really strong instructional leader. I have a background in doing the hard work in literacy or being a department head and being a building level leader. I'm a systems level person in terms of building systems and processes so the organization can run really effectively. I believe in just sitting down and having conversations and resolving problems, both with labor management and personnel issues. I think a lot of people appreciate that I'm an open book, I'm accessible. I'll tell you the good things, and when things aren't going well, we'll have that conversation as well. But I'm just really committed to the work and making sure that, we do our very best for kids, because it's incredibly important business. The parents entrust us with a high level of importance, and I think we need to match that each and every day and take every situation with the utmost care. So some of my core values are around, fairness, high expectations, access and opportunity, high-quality instruction, high level of communication, and then also being accountable for results and saying, we missed the mark, but we're going to go back to the drawing board and we're going to come back and make it better next time. So those would be some of the things I would share with you.
Terrific, thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to have you here. What is your experience in developing in-house special education programs in both the short term and the long term? What have you done in your experience to try to make your special education department work better? In your preliminary review of Melrose Public Schools, our special ed programming, have you identified opportunities for immediate growth, and what are they?
That's a big question.
I know. It's like 5 questions. So let me know if you need me to repeat.
Let's go with the first one first.
Sure, okay. What's your experience in developing in-house special education programs in both the short and the long term?
Yeah, so in Nashua, as the assistant superintendent, I managed and supervised the director of special education. And there they had a department with 3 other directors. They had a district coordinator. And we really saw increased needs coming out of both the opioid epidemic with kids coming in, and then increased need across the system. And a lot of the work that we did there was both, programmatic in terms of anytime I was able to see a dip in enrollment and replace a gen ed teacher with a special ed teacher or behaviorist. We did that to build up programming, and then eventually we built to a place where we just frankly ran out of space to build up programs. So we built an advocacy route for obtaining another building where we could house our preschool, our support staff, and our alternative behavior program, so that we could build out more specialized programs at all the elementary schools to handle the level of need and services for kids. And that's a great move because, we want to keep in district, in their neighborhood schools with the community. But the flip side of that is also building up all the tier 1 instruction that happens in buildings as well. And that's a great proactive mediation measure in terms of providing high quality instructional materials for all kids and teachers, provided with professional development to make sure instruction is accessible and available to all students, and so they can achieve at a high level. Ready for question number 2?
Yep.
Yep.
What have you done in your experience to try to make your special ed department work better?
So I think I shared in my interview that there was considerable concern around the entire special ed program and department when I was the interim superintendent. And The union wanted to file a grievance, which I didn't see as a means to really resolve the issue, so we put together a joint kind of task force, if you will, to manage all of that. And they did some surveys and presented the information, and then I went school to school to all 18 schools and met with all the special ed teams and put together kind of a response plan for the next year and a half around shaping improvements in special education. And some of that, frankly, goes to the pre-referral process and the intervention piece for kids, as well as identification, professional development, more support for special educators and regular educators, work in the EL space. And that's why some of the things that I see you doing here, that we're doing in Milton around UDL and so many other things, building inclusive environments for kids is a great proactive measure. So I've done a lot of programmatic pieces there and problem solving, and it's always a challenge given the limited resources that we have in coming to creative solutions that could work for kids. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, we have a part 3, sorry.
Well, you kind of answered it. So you, in your preliminary review of Melrose Public Schools and our special ed programming, have you identified opportunities for immediate growth, and what are they?
So I reviewed Carrie Berman's entry plan and the work she's done there, and I see and hear from today's visit that things are progressing in the right direction. You know, the out-of-district piece and the cost that's associated with that is a huge concern, and monitoring the out-of-district placements is a piece of that. I think I would want to have more conversations before I make assumptions around improvements, but I think monitoring that going forward, we've had more kids going out of district, which incurs costs. So we're bringing in partnerships with NEC and other PD opportunities to keep kids in district. And it's always been a goal to bring kids back from district, and that should be sort of the programming that happens at the team level in terms of what's the exit plan or return plan back to the schools. So I think there's always room for growth in those things, but again, I like to engage at a level where I can listen and learn from people and create meetings and structures where they can honestly tell me what's working and what's not. So in some of my conversations today, it seems that there's a need for, systems of communication and way things flow through and from district office to the schools so that they can identify those issues in a prompt and responsive way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mr. Sell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome. Good
Thank
to see you again.
Good to see you.
So talk to us, please, about your approach to communication with the school committee, the district's administrators, the faculty and staff, and importantly, the community at large, including residents, not just school families and caregivers, along with local business community and our nonprofit and cultural sector.
Yes, there's a lot.
We like compound questions.
So the rule of thumb is always to be proactive, right? We want to be proactive in communicating all the good things that are happening in the district. And, some of the things that I've, had questions regards to and I spoke to today is around, the website. Is there a dedicated person that does communications? Who's monitoring kind of the PR front or social media? Coming together with a concrete plan on communications. That's something we did in our last district after going through a communications audit with a company and doing surveys to parents and families around what's working, what's not working. Are you getting the information you want in a timely manner and not? And then coming to the school committee with a comprehensive communication plan that says, these are the consistent, reliable ways that district's going to communicate with you about certain things. And I think that goes a long way because there's certainly a lot of misinformation out there that travels faster than the truth. And we got to find our kind of proactive ways to go out there. And that's one means of doing that, but I really, post-COVID, believe that the best way is to do that and go in person. So the job of the superintendent, and during the challenging times that I faced as a year and a half, was going in person and presenting our plans for the year. So I went to faculty meetings, I went to teachers meetings and their lunches, I went to PTO meetings, I met with the Rotary, I went to the city, I met with legislators, I outlined everything that we're doing to recover post-pandemic and get kids from school, and just answered questions, because I think, like I said, visibility brings credibility. When people know that you speak and say what you mean and mean what you say, and then you can follow that up with clear and transparent communications, it goes a long way. And that was the key for us. We were one of the last districts in February of whatever year that was, still being remote and having to pivot to get back to hybrid and then getting back to in-person before June. And I started with district updates after every school board meeting because everything was fluid, right? We had changes in health and safety and instructional models and where am I going to drop my kids off? And over time, that became this kind of benchmark going forward that's still in place now, which also included school committee, the superintendent's update from school board meetings, because not everybody tunes in and hears that, and there's a lot of good information in there, so I embedded those in there as well. So I think it's really kind of a robust plan that you need to put together, and the value of going through an audit like that, it uncovers what's working and what's not, and then bringing that plan and sharing it with the school committee and then presenting it to the public of saying, this is how we're going to communicate. You're going to know that we're going to communicate with you, good and bad and different in these ways. And particularly, we've had a safety issue or two over the last year where things didn't go well, and our safety and crisis teams have worked carefully to restore that in terms of using Blackboard, text, emails, when and if there's a lockdown, when and if an incident happens, people can be assured that your kids are safe, your families are safe, the whole district knows that we responded in a key way. So again, I think that goes into that whole space of being a good ambassador, being trustworthy, integrity, all that matters when you're communicating. Because in the absence of communication or you telling the story, people fill the void with other information.
Thank you.
Ms. McKinney.
Thank you. Hi, welcome. Good to see you again. Could you please share a challenging professional situation that you have faced as superintendent and tell us about how you handled that situation, why you made the decisions you made, whether you anticipated the reaction from the community, how you dealt with that reaction either way, and whether, given the public response, you would, in hindsight, make the same decision again?
I mean, certainly the most challenging situation that, the leadership team kind of put on the table was coming out of the holiday COVID surge and trying to keep schools open. And we were at a very fragile spot in returning, and that was kind of a chunk of time where we were back in person. Our staffing was collapsing. I was deploying every available personnel to staff buildings to keep it open for kids. I was in schools doing lunch duty and being in the main office and teaching classes. But the only options were to pivot back to hybrid learning, which had mixed emotions, both from parents and teachers. It's a lot of work. Kids miss out on instruction, or to cancel school in hopes that we would recover from COVID. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep schools open, and a lot of our, most fragile kids or vulnerable populations really missed out on chunks of time. And the leadership team did a good job standing there in their corner and saying that it's the best option. The union doesn't want to go back to hybrid learning. It's going to require more work. We should really make the decision to close. So I announced the closure of school for a period of time to just let our staffing models recover and get people back from being on quarantine and COVID. And slowly, incrementally, it got better, but it was a challenging time because everybody was tired. Everybody wanted to be back. We were compensating people doing extra duty. I would say that was probably a decision that was tough to make. The community was understanding, but again, the expectation was to get back slowly to full in-person instruction. And, I can see on the outside that everything's normal. You drop your kid off, they go inside, but we had safety issues of supervision and other things that really made that decision the best of not so many good decisions at the time that we executed, and it worked out in the end. But that would be one I would share with you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for that thoughtful response and for your leadership during COVID.
Oh, thank you.
The City of Melrose's motto is one community open to all. Given the recent turmoil in public education and the increasing politicization of education nationwide, what is your approach as a school leader with regard to equity, inclusion, and diversity within a school community while being mindful of the cultural tension between tradition and change?
Yeah, and that's really where the work is right now. And, in Milton, I went there particularly around that work and came back to Massachusetts for that work because I think it's fundamental going forward. And the equity work really sets a foundation for so many other key things moving forward. It's embedded in the strategic plan. It helps address disproportionality and opportunity gaps going forward. it levels the playing field. It does so many important things. And the world's becoming increasingly diverse, but at the same time, there's not widespread agreement on the path moving forward. So part of the work is, yes, committing to the importance of the work, but also navigating the challenges and the disagreements that come along with that. And I've been in contentious board meetings, with a lot of people there who don't necessarily agree with all those things that we're doing. But the best part of our work that we've outlined going forward is we've done metrics, we've set goals, and frankly, we're achieving them, and we have the data to support it, that we're making an impact on kids that have been in marginalized groups that were subject to discipline or subject to over-identification in special education. All of those things, we're turning the tide on that, and that's the greatest success when the proof is in the pudding. So it is part of the work going forward, and I understand the environment that we live in, but I'm committed to opening access and opportunity for all kids so they can achieve at high levels. I've been very fortunate in my life. I want that for all the kids coming into the Melrose schools, so that they have the same opportunities. And we were on a Zoom call tonight with the Metco families, and that's some of their concerns in terms of communication, access and opportunity, after-school programs, being a voice in the shape of the future of the strategic plan. So all those things should be a part of the work of the superintendency and the leadership team to address those issues that are so important in terms of equity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. McKinney, this question is about communication district-wide and citywide in relation to the school budget and finances. And by way of framing, you talked a bit about the connection between what makes a community attractive as a place to live and the state of its public schools. With that in mind, if you would, please share your thinking about an approach to engaging both the school community and, importantly, the wider community around the school budget specifically and the financing of public education generally.
So I guess I would share two things. One, with every crisis, there's an opportunity, and I think the opportunity here is to share more about the public funding and how schools run from soup to nuts in terms of how the funding formulas, appropriations, all those things, and having that conversation on a wider scale. That was the same thing that happened in New Hampshire around the it's a funding fairness project that they're running there that we brought in terms of communicating with various stakeholders around how schools are run and why some schools and districts are better funded than others. And I think it's a conversation to have, and I've shown that I've gone to great lengths to kind of communicate that in terms of meeting with legislators, going to Rotary community officials, going to the select board, meeting with the city hall officials and having that conversation. I think when people learn, and some of the feedback I heard today was, this is a mean, lean organization that's doing a lot with a little, and that's not uncommon. But people need to know and hear about that, in a positive way and having conversations and giving them examples, as well as, maintaining strong fiscal responsibility of the funds that are available to you and using them in every possible opportunity in the best possible way. It's not dissimilar to where we are in Milton in that, we have limited resources, very residential, kind of landlocked, overcrowding, limited on space. So we're having those conversations around funding and per pupil allocation and circuit breaker, Chapter 70, free cash. All of that is part of the conversation so people know how we fund our schools. But in the end, our resources are, infinite. So telling the story in terms of how we use our funds and what's available to us and how it may be different from surrounding communities that, well, they do this here. Well, it's contextual. Every city and town operates in a little unique way. So I'm happy to have those conversations, and if there's a way to appoint a joint committee or a joint task force that can do that kind of work and share it out and go to PTO meetings and put the word out, I think that's really important information. It's not the most attention-grabbing subject, but behind the scenes, people want to know, why is this building falling apart, or why are the teachers getting what they need? In the end, that comes down to that bottom line kind of understanding of why things happen the way they do.
Very good. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Roeder.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate those comments, because you're absolutely right. Every city and town's a little bit different in what they can do and how they approach the finance piece. I want to, you've touched on it in a couple of contexts already, in the special education context, and some of your work during COVID around collective bargaining, around, around not just negotiating around contract, which obviously happens, but grievances, arbitrations, ideally avoiding that, creating an atmosphere we might not, where that's kind of a worst case scenario. Can you talk about some of the things in your career that touch on collective bargaining? I said you've already done it, so I feel like a little bit it's covered territory, but if you want to follow up, that would be terrific.
Sure. I just think that, and I shared during the interviews, that this is a people business. So dealing with people and building trusting relationships and being open and honest and being a good listener is really key. And some of the things that have worked in the past are meeting with the union president on a weekly basis, meeting with their e-board on a monthly basis, resolving grievances in accordance with the contract and the grievance procedure and keeping to the timeline. I probably resolved maybe over 15 grievances during my time there, some with monetary conditions, but also progressive discipline issues resolved there too. In Nashua, there are 7 different bargaining units: teachers, paras, secretaries, food service, principals, directors, and non-affiliated staff. So it's a Navy SEAL boot camp in terms of labor relations and understanding contracts, working JLMs, the grievance process, handling investigations, personnel matters. We've come to a place in Milton now, although we have some turnover, we're in a really good place. We have 8 to 10 working to JLMs. We're making some progress. They've complimented us. We're complimenting them. And I think that ties into the overall climate and culture of the school district in terms of employee satisfaction and feel like they're being recognized, valued, appreciated, and so forth. So, I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Ms. Rosie Thomas.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, what do you love about working with students? How do you stay in touch with them at all levels and elevate their ideas and voices?
Yeah.
That's a shorter group of questions.
I like that one, yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm like a big kid inside, so the best part is being in schools on a weekly basis. Part of my entry plan I shared tonight was shadowing kids for the day and pretending to be a first grader. We have 2 different programs. We have French immersion, and then we have our English pathway. I did much better in the English pathway than the French version. But I also go, and while I'm there shadowing for the day, I did focus groups with the teachers, and I did focus groups with the student leadership groups at all the schools, which was the best part. A lot of superintendents now are forming student advisory groups. I used to meet with the student reps to the board on a regular basis and hear about their questions and concerns, and they really did a great job through COVID in terms of bringing questions and concerns from students on why is hybrid being done this way, or why can't we return to full in-person, and doing some surveys and presenting valuable information. I think kids should have a voice on the table in terms of what we're doing and why, and they really provide key, insightful comments. And again, if you provide systems and structures and routines where they know that they have a safe space to have a conversation with an adult and share those things, it's really empowering. I think going back to some of the equity work we've done, aside from an equity audit, the DEI director and the RJ coach have really had some nice focus groups that uncover, challenging situations with kids where they're feeling like they're not fully inclusive, and there have been situations that need attention that don't come out in traditional reporting forums. So I think, again, we use the hard data as much as we can, but you got to have time and space to have those really intimate conversations that lend more insight than just numbers on a page.
Qualitative and quantitative.
Yeah, there you go. Know the lingo.
Anything else for that one? You good?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. DeSalle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, it's a two-parter, but they're closely related, I promise. What is your experience with building district budgets and overseeing how monies are spent and accounted for? Additionally, in this regard, Can you share your view of the role of superintendent in relation to budget development, management of expenditures, and accounting and reporting on an ongoing basis? See, it's really just one big question.
Yep. So in Nashua, with 18 schools and a $100 million budget, it's very different in terms of those sort of things. There are a lot of fiscal controls, procedures, policies. There's subcommittees to the school board. That was a lot of the work that I saw there in terms of compliance and building a budget based on district office and hearing the needs by department. Switching over to Milton, it's much smaller, much different. A lot of the needs come from the schools themselves in terms of their site councils or their instructional leadership teams. I work closely with the assistant superintendent for business in terms of shaping those sort of priorities. But really, your second part of that question is the superintendent should be working with the leadership team to shape priorities that support the strategic plan and advance the core values of the school district. So that's kind of our North Star that we're working to align all those things to. It's not uncommon to have a wish list that's longer than capacity, so there's always some prioritization and communicating to those needs. But again, to some of the other questions that were asked tonight, communication's a key part of that, understanding the funding and available and how the city and the schools are structured to support these things, and then making the argument for key priorities moving forward that impact kids. And that's been the work that we've done this year in terms of we need more special education support. That's what we're advocating for. We're advocating for another equity position because it's key to all the other work that we're having. We do need a technician to help support and put back Chromebooks back together again after they've been gone through some challenging times. And then blanking on the last position, but I think we've traveled a road this year of being kind of underfunded, and the disappearance of ARPA funds to getting to level to now even getting into some of the needs that we need going forward. So we've been fortunate, but it's certainly a challenge. A lot of communities are in that same space. So I think all of that ties into some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of shaping a budget with strategic planning, communication, looking at data and information, hearing from the people on the ground, leveraging your community partners if you can, accessing grants, and trying to put together a budget that meets the needs of the entire system.
If I may, could you just expand a little bit more on the accounting and reporting aspect?
So in the last district, there were a lot of fiscal controls that were put in place by policy and procedure. We used not Munis Lawson there in terms of our accounting, and there's a regular accounting of all the funds by the COO on a regular basis to the school committee. And there were policies and procedures for approval for expenditures over a certain amount, how many bids or quotes you had to get, reporting out on a regular basis and spending, turnover in personnel, you're on track for your spend for the year or not. Those sort of things are in my wheelhouse in terms of understanding and operating those sort of things, if that's what you're referring to. I think the stronger those fiscal controls are, the stronger or the less likely you'll have, accounting errors or inaccuracies or challenges with funding. So during my time there, we went through several financial audits, reviews from state officials, all grants, didn't have a challenge there. And thankfully, the assistant superintendent I work with now has a PhD in math, and he's really the fiscal control. He knows the budget inside and out. But it's not uncommon when transitions happen that some of that institutional knowledge and everything else goes with that person. So when those transitions take place, what does the support structure look like, and what are the books that are left behind, and the good procedures and practices that stay behind that keep the organization sound is really key, because there have been a lot of transitions in education in the last couple of years.
Very good. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Ms. McAndrew.
Thank you. You've spoken about building trust with educators, building trust with students, building principals. We'd love to hear more about building trust with the community. So how does an effective superintendent generate and sustain trust in their school system with the community? And if you could provide an example or two, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so trust doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and effort, and I think people appreciate that you're visible and present. You're in schools. You can speak directly to what's happening there. You go to places where you can meet and greet them and talk to them, whether it's community events, PTO meetings, the public library, the big back-to-school night, new teacher orientation, graduation, wherever they are, that you have those conversations. And it's not uncommon over time that some of the people I run into say, my kid saw you in their classroom, or you had lunch with them, or, oh, that was so neat that you taught a lesson in the classroom. Those things go a long way into garnering trust, because you're not only saying it, they can prove that you're doing it and you're there, and that you're there in times of the good times, and then you're also out when there are challenging times to have that communication. I shared during the screening committee, I think that is key to building relationships and advocating for schools and going in person and having conversations wherever they can be, whether it's at the schools or the YMCA, the Boys and Girls Club, the Adult Learning Center, the public library, sports organizations, any of those places. I'm happy to have conversations and talk about how we can work together and what the work is going with schools. And that's kind of the things I've done in the past. So I think it certainly ties into the communication plan, but it's also that piece of knowing that every Friday I'm in schools, I'm out visiting and seeing what's going on, and people will know and see me there, and then that kind of stuff will come out through newsletters and share, the insights and the communications and the inner workings of the district, and let people know that they can see and hear that, the superintendent's right on top of things and knows what's going on.
Thank you.
And this is our last question. Please describe your vision of a high-functioning professional culture in school buildings, and how, depending on your assessment of a starting point, you embed practices that evolve into or maintain that high-functioning culture. I'll say it again if you want.
Sure.
Okay. Please describe your vision of a high-functioning professional culture in school buildings, and how, depending on your assessment of a starting point, you embed practices that evolve into or maintain a high-functioning culture.
Mm-hmm. So we did some work a couple years ago around high-performing teams, and we know what the dysfunctions of a team are. And if you work backwards from that, again, the underlying piece would be trust. You can't build anything without a shaky or a solid foundation. If it's a shaky foundation, it's not going to work. Some of the elements that go along with that are, fear of conflict, fear of results, fear of accountability. All of those things would be key in terms of building a high-quality, functioning organization that's committed to success. Some of the ways that you get there is, again, by building relationships, having honest, direct conversations, building norms, outlining goals, holding each other accountable, reviewing what's working and what's not working. All of those things, I think, are key to moving forward. And I think, frankly, I came into the interim superintendent role in Nashua when we were a dysfunctional team. We weren't even back in the buildings. Not a lot of confidence in being able to get kids back into school, and I was able to kind of put folks back together again, meet with them individually and collectively, start shaping district goals, outlining school goals, working closely with public health officials, and getting kids back to some sort of normalcy in terms of hybrid and then eventually in-person learning, bridging disagreements in terms of a parent group that was out front and didn't agree with how we were doing. My predecessor refused to meet with them. My first thing was, let's sit down and have a conversation, move forward. One of my expectations for a professional culture is that we do exactly that we sit and we talk. We're not yelling. We can have our disagreements, but let's have a conversation. We ask the same with kids. When they're in crisis, let's sit down and resolve that. And that's why I think our circles and restorative work has really been so key this year, of outlining those expectations for resolving conflict and disagreements. And those would be some of the hallmarks that I would look for in terms of a high-functioning organization, and that's some of the work I brought in there in terms of putting in structures, systems, processes, clear agendas, running productive meetings, being open to feedback, being visible and present, showing up during the challenging times and praising folks for doing the good work. There's a lot there in your question, but I hope I covered some of them, because in the end, this is really, collective people work. We want collective efficacy where people are working in the same ways for similar goals and rowing in the same direction. And all that takes, dynamic work in leadership and communication, so many other things that you spoke about tonight to make it all happen.
Very helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
And since that is our last question, we'd love to have you provide some closing remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you again for the time tonight and the time today. And again, I would just point back to those kind of key things that I think make me a strong candidate and match for the position here in terms of budget experience and fiscal controls that we talked about, and keeping the books in place, being a clear communicator, visible, transparent, and trustworthy, and kind of being the ambassador for the schools, dealing with complex problems and resolving them, from Department of Justice, OCR complaints, to labor relations pieces that we talked about there. A track record of using data and analytics to improve academic outcomes for all kids and putting interventions in. And then lastly, a strong human resources background and resolving challenging personnel issues, from grievances, investigations, harassment, any of those sort of things, I think are all part of the work that I've done over the last couple of years. So again, I thank you for your time. I wish you the best of luck in your deliberations and your search, and appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are very grateful for your being here tonight. And as Mr. O'Connell referenced, and Mayor Broder referenced, you've had a long day with us, and we're delighted that you could spend some time and meet some of our folks, see some of our city, which we all, of course, love and care about. And we're grateful to our community for joining us in this work. And we encourage everybody to please fill out the form and let us know your thoughts, and that's right on the superintendent search part of our website, so a strong encouragement to do that. And that will conclude our work for this evening. May I have a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second.
Made by Mayor Broder, seconded by Ms. Rousey Thomas, and with no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? That motion carries unanimously with one absent, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to this special meeting of the Melrose School Committee. Today is March 23rd, 2023. And first I would like to call to order this meeting. Call the roll, please. Ms. Withy is absent tonight. Mr. O'Connell.
Here.
Ms. McAndrew.
Here.
Ms. Rousey Thomas.
Here.
Ms. DeSalm.
Here.
Mayor Broder.
Here.
I am here, and Dr. Kuchenberger is not here. We do have a quorum of 6 members. Therefore, again, this meeting is called to order, and let us rise as we are able and say the pledge. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And I'll note that this meeting is being recorded and televised by MMTV. And it is our pleasure to welcome Dr. David Ryan, who is here with us tonight, and talk with us about his finalist candidacy for Superintendent of Schools. The way we will proceed tonight is I will provide Superintendent Ryan with the opportunity to make some opening remarks for 2 to 3 minutes. Then we'll have a series of questions for you. Those questions, I will tell you, are filtered in a couple of different ways. One is from feedback from the community. They have weighed in and shared with us their interests in their next superintendent, and we certainly wanted to reflect that, those interests in our questions. And the second filter, if you will, is through the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Superintendent Evaluation Rubric. And as you likely know, the evaluation rubric is used by all licensed educators in the Commonwealth with some specificity around the different roles. So these questions reflect the 4 standards of the evaluation rubric, those being leadership, management and operations, family and community engagement, and professional culture. So we feel that all of our questions align in some way with at least one of those standards. And then, so you'll have about 4 minutes, so you can decide that, how that will go, and then we'll invite some closing remarks from you. So if you'd like to open, please do so.
Excellent, thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you to the school committee for sponsoring such an inclusive and comprehensive search process from beginning to end. I think not just today's site visit, but certainly the questions that were asked in the screening committee and the information that was available to me helped me make a very strong and confident decision in fulfilling my obligations as a candidate and ultimately as a finalist, and has really weighed favorably on my thoughts of candidacy for moving forward if selected as a superintendent. So I want to thank you. It was very well done. My name is David Ryan. I'm currently the superintendent of schools in SAU 16, and how many times I've said that today is irrelevant because there are people who may be watching who have not heard that yet. SAU 16 is a seacoast community of 6 towns. We have 7 school districts, and I report to 8 school committees. The first is the SAU Joint Board. There are joint boards or boards in New Hampshire, committees in Massachusetts. It's a 33-member joint board, and they are my boss. And they are a joint board when the 7 school district school boards are together in one room. And we meet 5 times a year, obviously much more necessary during COVID, but 5 times a year otherwise. We have close to 5,000 students in that school district. We have 11 schools, including our adult education program. We operate pre-K through 12, and we work as a close neighbor with Phillips Exeter Academy on a number of different initiatives designed really to help improve life in the greater Exeter area. I am the proud father of 3 boys, one who graduated Harvard and is now in New York City, another who's a junior studying journalism in Northeastern, and a third who's a high school senior at Manchester High School Central and going to St. Anselm College next year, where he's going to, he tells me, major in baseball and take some business classes. So we'll see about that. My career in public education started early, back when I was just coming out of college. I have a life story that I can share in a little bit. I will not have time in my opening. But it prompted me to go on to college 5 years after I graduated from high school due to several family and life issues that took precedent, where I was a non-traditional undergrad student, having worked my way all the way through the doctoral level at Boston College, benefit of 2 degrees from Boston College. My undergrad was at Plymouth State, and my education specialist degree was at UNH. Throughout that experience and my years serving as a teacher, assistant principal, assistant superintendent, and 1 year as an athletic director for the city of Manchester while serving as an assistant superintendent for the year, I've gained a lot of insight into a number of different aspects relative to operating a public school system, from an instructional perspective all the way up through a governance perspective. And so I believe that I've gathered the experiences, the skill set, the network, and the mentors that's prepared me well for this position here in Melrose Public Schools. And after today's visits, I feel I'm even more qualified and certainly excited about the opportunity to be your next superintendent of school. So with that, I know we're limited on time, and I want to be able to afford the responses to all of your questions, so I am all yours.
Very good. I will invite Ms. McKinney to begin, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Superintendent Ryan. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you for being part of this process and for being with us today in Melrose. Our first question starts with kids at the center. What do you love about working with students? How do you stay in touch with them at all levels and elevate their ideas and voices?
The first question, what do I love working with students?
What do you love about working with students?
Oh, their honesty. By and far, their honesty. I love the fact that students, regardless of their age level, they can visualize and articulate a future that they see, which to me is a beautiful thing because it's not one that I can see. whether it's a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old, or in some cases a 21-year-old. And that creates a lot of hope and optimism and joy for me. So by far and large, that is the most, that's the greatest joy I get out of my position, being able to work with students in that regard. Now, all of the things that lead to that, and ensuring that high-quality instruction, school safety and student security, ensuring that there's nutrition, there's ample exercise, there's a warm and loving place for every student to want to be a part of. That's the operations piece and why I endeavor to do that kind of work. And so that's the student piece. The way to stay connected with them is certainly a lot of visitation, not just in classrooms, but certainly in common spaces. So we spend a lot of time listening in hallways. So we have opportunities to engage in conversations with students. Middle and high school, really, where it's more appropriate for those types of activities. We're listening to key words, we're listening to key phrases, trying to understand some of the issues that are occurring within the student population that wouldn't normally surface to an adult conversation, and then engaging in conversation with students about what it is that we just heard, or the collection of things that we had just heard. I certainly attend a number of different events that students are putting on. I'm known to pop into a phys ed class and spike a volleyball. I've been spiked on before as well. So being able to participate in student activities. We have a superintendent cabinet where we hear from students or representative from the elementary, the middle, and the high, ranging issues from what's happening in food service, whether there's enough time to get to class, are there enough kangaroo balls out in the Gaga pit, those kinds of things that, we really like to hear student climate issues. And then we're fortunate this year that it was passed in the New Hampshire State Legislature where we have a non-voting member but a student representative on our school board. And so now moving forward at school committee, we'll not just have a report from the high school, but we have an active student who's currently a sophomore who brings issues to the table, works with school committee members to kind of go through some of the issues that are occurring within student life, which is really helpful to us. But it also gives, Sawyer is his name, Sawyer and I, the opportunity to kind of carve out some very niche issues for instruction that I may not otherwise have the opportunity to do so because I wouldn't have had his perspective. So that's a variety of ways that I work with our students and stay connected with them.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful.
Sure.
Ms. DeSalle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello again. So you've talked a lot about communication today, but and I've certainly heard you talk about communication earlier. But for those at home, could you talk to us, please, about your approach to communication with the school committee, the district's administrators, faculty and staff, and importantly, the community at large, including the residents, not just school family and caregivers, but the local business community, our nonprofit, and our cultural sector?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. It's talking a lot about communication seems like it's ironic, isn't it? And
could you communicate about communication, please?
Communicate about communicating. I think there are a number of different ways that we communicate. First, with our school committee. I've already shared with you before I left the high school a few of our artifacts of how we keep people informed relative around some of the key issues that I've heard today, being trust and budget and communication. So you'll find in your email inbox on your Melrose email address 4 links to some key artifacts that we've used or we currently use with our school committee to keep them informed of things that are happening in the community. A board report, a budget balance sheet with an encumbered fund balance amount, our budget book, and certainly a couple of other items. That's for your reading pleasure at another time. But just as an example of how we keep our school committee members abreast of what's happening in the school district. It's more than just simply reporting out at school board meetings activities that are occurring in our schools, but really we dig into key issues that are taking place or forming that may or may not arise as a key issue at the board level. We feel that our school board members and our school committee members, I certainly would hold that here, are key communicants of the message and the mission of the public school system. And so we want to make sure that you have all of the information necessary so that when you're at Shaw's right out here, or you're at the soccer field and somebody asks you a question about what's happening in the schools, you're able to answer it. Or you have a resource, because you can't memorize everything, you have a resource that you can go to at least have that answer. Communications during crisis situations, whenever there are lights at a school, whether it be red or blue, we want you to know that we had an ambulance or a police cruiser at the school and the reason why we had it, protecting the anonymity of any individual that's concerned. Because for every occurrence that happens at the school, that parent who's driving by that calls you and says, hey, I just saw that there's a police car at the school, can you tell me what happened? And you don't know. That's not a position that we want our school board members in. And then we think of the ripple effect inside of the school where the students who are texting their parents, and a parent gets that text and contacts one of you. We want that information, if it's not already out by the school, at least to be out in the community about why that's taking place so that everybody can be calm. Communicating in general, we operate through a written form, right? Digital technology is a wonderful thing. So a superintendent's newsletter every month that incorporates our message, our monthly theme, and all of the activities that I think are shared at your school committee meetings, we share in a newsletter to the broader community. Our schools communicate every Friday via newsletter with our parents. We use a phone system which alerts people to the fact that we have very important information that we've just sent to you that we'd like you to go to, so we can text directly to people's phones that will alert them to information that we want them to have, regardless of what that information is. We videotape, and we don't even videotape anymore. We record and broadcast Curriculum Corner, which is an interview of predominantly students and teachers about what's happening inside of schools around specific curriculum instruction and assessment issues. Post that on our website, and then we draw people's attention to it so they can look at what is competency-based education, what is student-driven assessment, what is that all about, what are the reasons behind it. And kids and teachers tell the community what that's all about. We do direct mail to our community members in New Hampshire. In our current community, we have 80% of our households who don't have children enrolled in our schools. Yet we expect them to pay their taxes to fund the schools for the future leaders of that community. We want them to know what it is that they're voting for, and that's why we have our budget books and we draw people to our hub, which is our website. So we have a whole host of communication activities. The easiest one I have found is to simply be present, is to show up, is to be visible at activities, to be present in schools, to talk with kids, to listen to questions, listen more than talk. Listen to your teaching staff, the administrative team, be with parents, be with community members, visit some of the businesses and just simply sit and listen to what people are having to say and engage in a conversation with them and ask them questions about, identify who you are so they don't think you're some creepy guy coming in to ask questions. But, I'm really interested in learning more about that specific issue. Can you help me understand it more? That communication method, that visibility, that showing up, and that constant transparent communication breeds trust because routines are established. People have expectations then that visibility is going to take place. People believe that when you say something or hear something, you actually do it. They see it. So that.
Very good, thank you.
Yes.
Ms. Rosie Thomas.
I'm curious about your core values and how you practice them in your role as superintendent, and then if you've had challenges to them, how you face up those.
So a couple of key core values. Respect all human differences is my very first and one I abide by, and has not necessarily been one I've come into conflict with, but one I've had to fight to support and withstand some fairly significant attacks. Most recently is yesterday from a known white supremacist who's attacked me and two other colleagues for doing what they consider to be anti-white work in the state of New Hampshire, and that now I'm a marked person in their network. So that's a little chilling, but at the very core, understanding, respecting, and believing in all different perspectives of everybody who comes together is unwavering in terms of what I believe in. The fact that all students can learn at high levels and that equity means that the same high expectations for all, different resources for each. And those two are kind of tied, where if we really mean that all students can learn, then let's really talk about what that means. So let's unpack what the word all means. And we spend an awful lot of time doing that. So when I say all, it means that when we have students who are in our classrooms, some of whom perhaps are getting additional services through an IEP, that doesn't mean that they're only serviced by those individuals who work within the special education department, that our classroom teachers are applying different levels of intervention for all students, recognizing that some need more resources, more intervention to achieve those same high expectations. Doesn't mean everybody's going to achieve the same outcome, but they're all going to have the same opportunity, and it's going to be proportional to the needs that they have based on the challenges and the issues that they present. And that's our job. And so as educators, we have to recognize that at the end of the day, our job is learning. It's not teaching. And there's a big difference in that approach. So I would tie all three of those core values into the work that I do and the energy and the passion I bring to my role, and ensuring that that's work that we aspire to do and that we deliver.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mayor Broder.
Excuse me. Hello, Dr. Ryan. Good to see you.
Mr. Mayor, it's nice to see you. Thank you.
You touched on this a bit. Yeah, I know you got some questions about it during the community session earlier today. And take as much time as you need to answer the question. Don't worry about the 4-minute thing. In terms of, if you could describe some of your experience developing in-house special education programming to, keep as many students as possible in-house. There's learning benefits to that. There's obviously financial benefits to that as well. And it's because none of our questions are just questions, they're 2- and 3-parters. In your brief exposure to the Melrose District, is there anything that you've seen in terms of our SPED programming that drew your attention, or places where there might be opportunities for growth or change?
I will be a little vulnerable and share that I was very disappointed that I didn't have the opportunity to meet with students in a format as a stakeholder group. I will share that. And part of that is my regret that I wasn't able to interact with students who were part of a special education program or have direct interaction with special education teachers. I was very pleased to hear from a few of our parents who are on our CPAC and who expressed a couple of concerns through their questions about my experience. So I just want, at the risk of turning this committee off, be able to share that with you, because I was told today to be who I am, and so I am being who I am. Because I feel that our community, with the number of students who we want to think of when we use the word inclusion, is not always limited to race, language, but certainly ability. And so just being upfront with that so I'm not able to put together a firm recommendation on what I would want to see in terms of changes or growth, but where I think all of us can grow is understanding and recognizing that at a very base level, students who need additional services in our classrooms and classroom teachers who are not adequately trained to address that is a glaring issue that exists in all school districts. So I would talk about, on an MTSS level, multi-tier system of supports, at a tier 1 level, that there has to be a significant investment of time and effort to help all teachers recognize that what I'm providing for one student is going to have to be different from what I provide for another student in the same classroom, which most classroom teachers will look at me and say, how on earth am I going to do that if I have 5 classrooms with 30 students in it? We're going to find out together. From my experience, how we have managed to do some of that work is provide some co-training, co-teaching models where qualified interventionists, as well as special education case managers and classroom content teachers, will plan together, and they'll challenge each other on what it is in terms of their instructional practices for any specific lesson, whether it's on a daily or a week-long or a unit basis. So engaging our colleagues to work together to challenge each other's approaches and beliefs with regard to teaching students in special education in an inclusive classroom. That begins to generate reliance and trust on each other, where if you show up to a work session to do that planning and you don't have your work ready, you're calling each other on it as colleagues or as peers. And it's all done in the interest of what's at the center, which is our students. On a grander scale, from a programming standpoint, and I shared this earlier with our community, is we identified that we have a growing number of students who are identified with a behavioral disability of some form under an IEP, that at the middle and the high school, we formed inclusive but specialized programming, one called ARC and one called SOAR, where we have specifically trained BCBAs or behavior interventionists, as well as specialists working with students on developing approaches to behavior, building in supports throughout the day, whether it be through a Zen Den approach or some type of deregulation room, being able to help students learn and identify when they're escalating and learn coping techniques to find ways to de-escalate. And so a significant amount of money that's been dedicated in-house for that to happen, where before students were being placed in out-of-district placements, which was extremely expensive, and it didn't keep our students with their friends, with their families, in their community. Another piece is we had a piece of property at the high school where we were able to transform it. It was a house that had originally been rented by the school district because it was part of the high school campus. We identified that as an opportunity using all grant money from our IDEA grant, renovating the entire house to make it handicap accessible, as well as turning it into a multidisciplinary use for our 18 to 22-year-old students who are in our transitional skills program or our life skills program. And what they've been able to do is get intense instruction, first English, math, science, social studies, language. So the skill building is still taking place from 18 to 22, but also their executive functioning and life skills training, where they're going to be learned to be self-sufficient when they graduate from our program at 22 years old, where if they're living independently or semi-independently, they can cook meals for themselves, they can keep their place clean, they can make their bed, they can do their laundry. They know how to take care of their yard, they understand finances at a base level. So being able to keep that program and have students be a part of that instead of, again, having them leave us was a huge effort, but we did it in conjunction with the state of New Hampshire. It isn't necessarily a saver of money as much as it is a saver of kids' dignity and families. And that was really what we were after with that. And I mean, there are a number of other examples that I could provide, and hopefully we'll be able to, but I don't think tonight's the night that I'm able to do that.
I appreciate the answer, and candidly, the question about what would you do immediately to fix or improve Melrose Public Schools special education. If you had given a substantive answer, I would have looked askance at that, because learn by doing, right? And
What do I know?
listen
right
to
now?
the stakeholders. Right. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the answer.
Yes, sir.
Mr. O'Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Ryan, how does an effective superintendent generate and sustain trust in their school system with the community? And if you would, please provide an example from your work.
Great. 2 words that my wife and I learned in the old days. When you were going to get married, you had pre-Caner. And so off to St. Joe's in Salem I went for our pre-Caner training. And the first 2 words that the deacon shared with us is show up. And there's a lot that's a loaded phrase, you show up. So regardless of the issue, topic, activity, purpose, you show up. And that means that you are invested and you are present. You ensure that what it is you're saying is truthful, because you then hold yourself accountable. If others won't, you will, to living up to what it is that you say. The only way that that's going to work, because people will sit back and say, oh, yeah, we've heard all of that before, right? We hear all about being visiting in classrooms. We hear all about going to the football games, and that's not necessarily building trust. It's just visibility, which people say, yeah, okay, the person's making an effort. What's the experience you're having? What's the experience others who are there with you having, that are going to then create this trustworthiness in the things that you're doing to be genuine? So speaking with our school leadership team today, it was really clear from one of the assistant principals that this idea of just showing up in the school, taking a picture with a student, or having someone take a picture of you reading a book and then tweeting it, and then leaving the school, doesn't necessarily generate the level of visibility that I'm after. It means I went to the school, I read a story, and I left. What was my impact? What was the impact of the students on me or the staff on me? What's the expectation from that? Are we able to then have an open discussion? Because maybe I saw 4 or 5 things that I have questions about that I want to ask. And maybe they heard something that I said that kind of caused them to look at me a little bit funny and want to talk to me about that. But are they comfortable enough to bring that to my attention? Is at a table with parents or students or staff members where there's clearly an elephant in the room that I don't see, is it a safe space for people to be able to say, hey, there's an elephant in the room, and have them feel comfortable to be able to do that without any fear of retribution? So there's some internal trust that I heard today needs to be built, as I believe most school districts are working through right now. There's certainly community trust that needs to be built. Again, that elephant in the room, you've deflated it, but it's still being discussed. We're talking about a $2.5 million appropriation of free cash to help with our budget. I had a really in-depth conversation today with some of the senior staff members on what caused that? How did that happen? How do you move forward to make sure that that doesn't happen? They're very open and honest about talking. Is all of that in the community, and are we able to share that with the community? How we do that now is each meeting that we have with school committee, we make sure that our school committee gets a balance sheet, they get an encumbered fund balance, and they have a line item budget that's constantly posted on our website under our budgets and elections page. So all 7 school districts consistently see a new draft of our budget as we're developing it, line by line. So you can go right down to, short of the name of the teacher, right down to the total number of dollars that teachers are being paid, right down to how much it's costing to pay for tissues. So people can see a bottom line and they can see what it's going to and be able to ask some really good questions about that. So the level of trust that I place in them is that they will do that work, that community members will look at that budget sheet, that they will pay attention at school committee and hear something and call us on it, so that there isn't a surprise down the road and we say, well, we put it up at the school committee or we put it on the website and you didn't look at it. That's not trust. That's not trust. That's just putting information out and kind of holding someone to, well, you know, if you didn't look at it. That's not how communication works. All of this is intertwined. So the level of communication that we're able to employ has to be both ways. We have to ask people for feedback, even if we don't like it, even if we know we're not going to like it. But that's going to build trust where people are going to feel valued and heard, that they've expressed what it is that they need to express, and then a reflection of that in whatever it is you decide to do moving forward. Doesn't mean that it's going to be what it is people ask for, but there has to be an acknowledgement that they were seen, heard, valued, and that there's a reflection in your consideration and the decision-making that is present. I think that builds trust.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure.
Would you kindly share a challenging professional situation you have faced as superintendent of schools and how you handled that situation? For example, why you made the decisions you made, whether you anticipated or gauged their popularity or unpopularity, how you dealt with the public reaction either way, and whether, given the public response, you would in hindsight make the decision again.
That I would make the decision again?
Whether you would.
Why? We were in a, so when I arrived in SAU 16, we had a middle school principal who was struggling a bit with a fairly strong teachers association and trying to move the needle at the middle school. And so we provided a number of supports in working with that principal. The principal ultimately chose after 3 years that it was not, it was her 5th year, but after my 3rd year, that it was not a tenable situation for her. She could not do the work she wanted to do. And so she submitted her, her resignation. And so it became late in the year, and we hired an interim principal for the middle school while we conducted a search. We worked through the entire search process, which was close to 3 months, and we arrived at 2 finalists, one of whom was the interim principal. And over that time, we had had the opportunity to work with the interim principal and really get to know the impact that the principal had on the school, with the staff, with the students, and really see the person in action, which is a great way to determine whether or not a person is going to be able to do the job that, one, they said they could do, and two, the job that's needed to be done. We had some issues arise and some circumstances occur where we made some assessments, and when we got to the finalist stage and had the interview process, a school board in New Hampshire is the legal body that hires certified staff only on the nomination of the superintendent. I know that there's a nuance here that that's not the case, but in New Hampshire, that's the law that we abide by. And this is not unknown to the candidates. I informed the board, even though they believed that we were going to make a nomination, that I was not making a nomination for either candidate. That went over like a lead balloon with 7 of the 9 school board members. And rightly so, because they had been led to believe that we were looking at this particular candidate for the hire. And we had not shared some of the issues that had arisen in our observation of the performance, because those are personnel-related issues that a school board is not privy to in the event that that board has to have a hearing based on any type of disciplinary action that takes place. And so I had to stand before the board and explain to them that I was not making a nomination and that we were going to either repost or look for an additional interim or ask that interim to serve a second year as an interim. Follow the fallout. So there were several conversations with individual board members, their level of disappointment. Some felt that they were blindsided, and they were. But we had to subscribe to a confidential process and protect the confidential personnel information as we're sworn to, and couldn't simply say to the board, here's why. That's not something that I was able to do, and so I didn't. And I think that led to some acrimony with some members of the board. Over the course of perhaps 2 weeks prior to that and through the next month, we had been meeting with the middle school staff to really understand more about what it is that they were seeking and what it is that they wanted to be able to do with their school. It's a very large school. And the more we listened, the more we understood they needed a bridge builder, somebody very different who could bring a different approach to leadership in the school. Somebody who was going to hold teachers accountable, but also provide the supports necessary for teachers to be able to get to where they needed to be. They had to do it in a collegial way, but they had to do it from a position of principle. And so we made a recommendation, we came back to the board and we made a recommendation to move forward with a principal of one of our elementary schools, one of our largest elementary schools, who met exactly what it was that we believe we needed to put into that school in order to move that school forward. The committee listened more about why we were sharing that with them, why we wanted to make that decision. They understood more about why we didn't move with the candidate, the finalist. And they're so happy right now because the difference this year from last year in that middle school is night and day. Would I do that differently? I would do it differently, but I would make the same decision because it was the right decision to make, because we would have set the school up for failure based on our working knowledge and observations of the candidate. We would have set that person up for failure because it already was not working for that person based on those observations that we had made. And we would have locked into a long-term contract for somebody who was just not going to be successful or happy based on the interactions that we had had. And the response after and the behavior after, remember, it's how high you leave the wood pile after you leave the stack. the behavior after was indicative of some behavior that I would not want any of our professionals to have in our schools, so that the board saw that and the board understood. So, I mean, I really go along the lines of confidentiality there, but I think it's important enough to share that that's the length I will go to ensure that what we have in our schools is the very, very best based on what our needs are, and the line that I will walk up to in order to make sure that that happens.
Thank you. Ms. McAndrew.
Thank you. On to round two here. The City of Melrose's motto is "One Community, Open to All." Given the recent turmoil in public education and the increasing politicization of education nationwide, what is your approach as a school leader with regard to equity, inclusion, and diversity within a school community, while being mindful of the cultural tension between tradition and change?
Change is hard, isn't it? Especially when you weigh it against tradition. I've heard some of that today as well. My commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and we added justice extends much further back than before I arrived in SAU 16, but our work in understanding that we have so many different perspectives and views and identities that come to our community, that in order to create a sense of belonging for all, that we have to create a safe space for everybody to be able to feel like they can share their identity, even if it is an oppositional identity. Maybe it's somebody who doesn't agree with your masking guidelines or vaccination or your political slant or any of your social emotional learning, which is something that we're getting. And now we're being attacked on our LGBTQ plus community work that we're doing. We want to hear that. So we try to create opportunity for learning exchanges, not debates. In a debate, somebody has to be right or wrong. I'm not interested in right or wrong. I'm interested in understanding. And so in this political climate, I want to understand more about what the oppositional views are, because it may actually inform what our views are coming from a different perspective. There are perspectives from people I've not even considered because I'm only one person. Our administrative team is very similar in that when we discuss issues, we make sure that we listen to voices that we normally wouldn't invite to the table. And so we've learned we invite them to the table. And our school committees have done the same thing, where our public input sessions invite anyone who wishes to come to the microphone and provide any feedback that they wish. And if they wish to ask questions and we can answer their question there, regardless of the nature of it, we'll do so. Because we want people to share that. We want to hear what those perspectives are. Now, we won't agree with them, but I am not going to try and stifle somebody just because I don't agree with their perspective. We also want to make sure that we don't try to change people's beliefs or values. So our mantra that we've kind of jumped onto, and it was our students who came up with the hashtag that we've adopted, is "You belong here." And that can mean something different for everybody who walks into our schools. But we want every single person who walks into a school to feel like that school was built specifically for them, and that the people who are there specifically to help them and to help them feel safe and help them do the things that they want to do. Not because that they're trying to fit in, but because they belong and they're accepted for who they are, not for what we want them to be. So our work through our Office of DEIJ, and Andres Mejia is a beautiful soul. He's the best listener I've ever met. Has really taught our administrative team to listen more, has really taught us really how to show hearts and minds so people can see the kind of work that we're trying to do to build our community. It's been an uphill battle, as it is in many other communities, but it's the right work to do. We also want our students to understand that in a predominantly white affluent community, that there's a world out there that you don't know much about, and we want to give you opportunities to understand all of the different lived experiences that people bring to our community, so that when you go into it, you're assimilating at a high level, and it's not the first time that you've talked to somebody who has speaks a different language than you, or has a different religious belief than you. So our work has been fairly comprehensive. In one of the artifacts that I did share with you is our annual report for our DEIJ work. It's a pretty comprehensive report on all of the work that we've done right around to building in affinity spaces for our middle and high school students, whether they be students of color, LGBTQ+, our religious faith community, students who want to come together, or we also have every Wednesday morning a leadership affinity space where leaders can come together and talk about their lack of understanding and knowledge of racial issues so that we can talk together and learn and grow together and be vulnerable with each other in a safe space. So there's a ton of work that we have been doing, and we've tried to encapsulate that in the annual report.
Great, thank you very much.
Mr. Saul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You touched on this earlier. We're going back to the budget now. Please share your thinking about and approach to engaging both the school community and, importantly, the wider community around the school budget specifically, and then more generally around public education finances.
Great, thank you. I think that it's taxpayers' money, and they need to know where it is. And we need to be able to show them where the money comes from, where it goes, and whether or not it was a worthwhile investment. And I think that's our role as stewards of public money in this area of public education, as it is on the city side. So we've built in opportunities for a bunch of eyes to be on our budget, not just with the digital side where we post everything, but inviting community members in on budget advisory committees that are non-statutory to provide us feedback on different funding, either projects that we want to fund or specific lines that we have that have a lot of dollars in them. I'll give you an example. Every year we budget for snow plowing. Okay, it's New England, and so we budget for snow plowing. But lately, every year, we haven't expended our full line for snow plowing. So for the last 2 years, a gentleman from East Kingston will come and sit, and he'll look, and he goes right to the snowplow line. And he says, how on earth have you not dropped this line? Look at the last 2 years. Look what you budgeted. Look what you spent. Look at the actuals. We know, but as soon as we cut some of that line, Snowmageddon's going to come, and we're going to be in big trouble. But we did relent, and we cut 10% from that line this year. So our finance director is extremely worried for next year because she thinks now we're going to get snow. But we get to that granular level where people are able to sit at a table, look at the budget, or simply view it online and make contact with us with some recommendations for cuts. Usually those are what the recommendations are, is reductions, reductions, reductions. Very rarely do we get someone who says, hey, I got a great idea. Let's add $500,000 to your budget for this project or that project. Usually our classroom teachers and principals try to do that. Making the budget more accessible to people will mean providing opportunities. So I have a copy of your 29 retreat, your finance retreat, where those slides do a great job of unpacking the different components of public schools financing for Melrose Public Schools. I think being able to provide opportunities for taxpayers in town to sit through some of those, or maybe engage in School Finance 101, so we can unpack our budget with them and show them what the levers are and where the mechanisms are. What is a circuit breaker? You know, what does that have to do with special education? What are some of the terms? Where does money come from? Why is my tax bill so high? Why do I pay property tax? What does that go to? And then try and help them understand that we're not going to fund our budget unless we have evidence to show that that investment has paid off. So when we go to the table to draft our budget beginning in the fall in a municipal situation, usually in August in my current situation with small town government, we ask principals who are building those budgets for discussion to have the evidence to support any increases to their lines. Okay, so we built this in, this was the project you wanted to do, or this was the program. Show us the evidence that it had an impact on student learning. Because if it doesn't have an impact on student learning, help me understand why we're spending money in a school when it doesn't impact student learning. So there has to be some attachment to that. And so we've had people try and move things through our budget that they haven't been able to because they can't provide the evidence. It's just something that they wanted to have in their school. And we'll hold firm on that. Public education in general, was that the second part of the question, Elizabeth? You know, certainly at the federal level, it's a disaster in terms of those federally required funding mechanisms like IDEA that ultimately, at least in the state of New Hampshire, are filtered through the clearinghouse, which is the New Hampshire Education Department. And so for every student we have, we get $3,700 per pupil. That's supposed to pay for an adequate education in a K through 12 school, which we know doesn't work, right? So when we look at our foundation budget and we see what it works out to per pupil, we then have to go to our property tax owners and we have to tax accordingly, because we have to look at our revenue side, which is adequacy, our IDA grants, any of our federal title grants, as well as what you call circuit breaker, what we call CAT aid, which is a special education reimbursement, as well as Medicaid revenue that we have to chase, which we don't always get qualified for. And we have to ensure that our forecasting on our revenue side is going to be able to take care of what we want to expend. And our taxpayers are the ones left literally footing the bill. And in the Commonwealth, I don't believe that that's any different, that there's a great number of taxes that are paid, a high number of taxes that are paid based on your equalized valuation and a number of other factors that I think factor into wealth. And people are spending money on a product that they may not have children involved in. So I think helping people understand that, spending time with people. I would sit with some members. I can tell you right now in East Kingston, we have a lovely couple who will spend time during budget season having coffee, talking through the budget and what we propose. Just spend some time walking through it and let them ask any question that they want to ask. And we can answer it. And if we can't answer it, then why is it in the budget? So we go to a lot of lengths like that. And I think that that's something that we may want to consider here in Melrose.
Very good, thank you.
Ms. Rousey Thomas.
Thank you. Please share your experience with collective bargaining with specific regard to contract negotiations, grievances, and also labor management relations more generally.
I think it was 2 years ago, we collectively bargained 9 agreements concurrently. That includes classroom teachers. So we had our largest teachers union, the Exeter Education Association. We also had the Administrators Association. For some reason, all 4 unions came up at the same time. So we've made an adjustment to the term of each of those agreements to offset, so we're not negotiating all 4 of those. And then we had some surrounding towns whose teacher and paraprofessional agreements we negotiated as well. My role is to serve as an advisor and sit with the negotiating team, which in New Hampshire is made up typically of a non-quorum number of board members who are at the table. In some instances, we may engage with legal counsel in the event that it's a complex negotiations, or we envision it being a complex or difficult negotiations because of some of the water cooler conversations that we'd had prior to negotiations. We know that those problems are going to arise, and so we usually would have legal counsel for some of those. We work through, first of all, a relationship building process with all of our UNISERV directors and union presidents. So we all have a clear understanding of what are going to be the expectations of the association, what are the expectations going to be from management, and what are some of the conversations that are taking place prior to getting to the table, so we can lay ground rules that are appropriate to making sure that we achieve those objectives, or at least have the conversations in the time to achieve those objectives. And then we would set into, after establishing ground rules, we would set into our negotiating process where items are being traded and shared and discussed, a lot of caucusing. So I've been involved in every step of the way, all the way up through ratification. The relationship that we've established with the UNISERV director for our area is strong enough where if there's an issue that arises, we're an NEA group as well. If an issue arises at one of the schools, whether it leads to a level 1 grievance or not, we have a conversation. I get a phone call. If there are issues with the bargaining, we have side conversations. The board chairs or whomever the chair of our negotiating committees are, depending upon the school district, rely heavily on the recommendations of the superintendent, or if there's a designee, so the assistant or associate superintendent working with a smaller negotiating process. And then we get the input from our school leadership, because if there are issues in working conditions that could have an overall effect on the operations of the school, we want the input from our school personnel as well. And so in terms of a grievance, it's kind of a similar approach. We have a longstanding relationship with all of our union representatives, and we have ongoing meetings. If, usually once a month, we'll meet with our union presidents from all of our districts. Some months we just sit and stare at each other and say, there's really not much to talk about. Or it's, gosh, we do have a problem, we kind of wanted to bring it to your attention. And so we have that conversation. If it's not resolved, or something happens at the school that we don't necessarily resolve, and the principal has the authority to do so and doesn't, then that level 1 becomes a level 2 grievance. And so I'll hear all grievance hearings, and we'll then work through a level 3 in front of the board, if necessary. We'll bring legal counsel in to represent the board, so I remain an objective party, because my decision can't affect where the board's going to go with that. And then if that doesn't work, then we go to arbitration. And so we've had some grievances go to arbitration. I'd say that we're a 500 ball club in terms of where we went with that, which leads me to believe that we're always all trying to do the right thing, and sometimes we think that we've done it, and sometimes we're not in the right. So there's an awful lot of work that's done. It's predominantly in the summer and the fall, because we have statutes that outline when collective bargaining agreements need to be ready for the warrant, when those need to be posted so that funding mechanisms can be in place to calculate a budget. So it's a really, usually we can resolve our contracts in 4 to 5 collective bargaining sessions of about 2 or 3 hours each. That would be long if it were a 3-hour session.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mayor Broder.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, thank you, Doctor. Related question, and
Yes.
that is, what is your vision for establishing, fostering, growing professional culture in each of the buildings within the district? And that could touch on anything around professional development, empowering principals, whatever the case may be. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you. So my research background is in building capacity of school leaders. We believe that next level leaders already work in our schools. And so I was really pleased today to learn that several of the people around that table of the school leadership team they started in Melrose, and they've worked and been promoted in the system based on their professional growth. I have an expectation that we're constantly learning. The safest place to not know something is a school, because the whole point is to learn. And we want people who not just are making sure that our students are learning, but they're learning as well. And so they're learning about their own practice. How are we becoming better at what we do within the classroom? How are our leaders becoming more versed in alternative leading styles, or adapting our leadership styles to situations that arise in our schools? What's the professional learning opportunities that we're providing? So in talking with some specialists today, I would want to ensure that our specialists, our boutique specialists, OTPT, some niche positions, instead of being included in an all SAU or an all school district professional learning opportunity that deals with a topic that doesn't pertain to their area of expertise, that we provide personalized professional learning for them. If we're a community that believes in personalized learning for our students, then I would hope that we as a community also believe in that for our adults, because adults learn differently just like our students do. And we certainly want to model that approach, starting with our staff, so that they can also learn that their learning styles are respected, valued, heard, and that the meaningful professional development that we're providing for them is specific to their role to do what they believe is best for kids. So that would be one of the approaches that I would have. Strong believer in lifelong learning. Doesn't mean that you have to go out and get a terminal degree, but it certainly does mean that if you're not going to try to get better at what you do each year, then I'm not certain why you want to continue working in a school where that's the number one reason we're there.
A quick follow-up.
Sure.
How do you define, how much risk is tolerable in professional development? How do you decide, when that risk is too big?
I'm trying to quantify risk. Can you give me a little context?
Sure. So, if say, a teacher comes to you with a building principal, someone in the district, and says, I would like to try some kind of new paradigm. And
Some kind of what? I'm sorry, Mayor.
paradigm, some kind of
Something a little off the beaten path that hasn't been seen before?
Exactly.
Okay.
how do you manage that? You want to let folks take chances, but they don't always work out.
That's right. And so we absolutely want to advocate for people to take risks. That's where we grow. We want to measure it to ensure that it doesn't have a negative impact on the people around, particularly students, or those peers, colleagues, or the educator, him or herself. What we want to do is encourage as much risk as possible. Risk leads to innovation. Innovation leads to open minds and different ways of seeing how we can accomplish things in newer, better, sometimes more efficient or inexpensive ways. So if somebody brings some kind of, I want to try and do this in my classroom, I'm really interested in, well, what's the desired effect? What is it that you're trying to get out of that type of activity? I'm going to support the activity. I just need to be prepared to support you in the event that it doesn't work and people are going to be critical. And so I can stand with you and say, no. We understood what this was supposed to do, but within failure is opportunity to learn as well. And then I would advocate that that person continue to try and take risks and continue to try and learn and innovate, because the only failure that I can see is if you stop trying. If you hit an obstacle, you just take a different path, right? And ultimately get to what it is that you want to get. But we're not going to stop trying.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. O'Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question, Dr. Ryan, this next to last question I can share, is a nuts and bolts budget and finance question with two parts. Part one, broadly speaking, what has been your experience with building district budgets and overseeing how monies are spent and accounted for? Part two, more specifically, please share your view of the role of the superintendent in relation to budget development, management of expenditures, and accounting and reporting on an ongoing basis. Please.
In 4 minutes. I think that it might be cliche, but when it comes to public money, it's the superintendent who lives and dies by the dollars that are spent. And so it's my responsibility to ensure that the money that we have asked for is spent in an appropriate way that's been planned and approved. Now, there are a lot of mechanisms that go into that, and it does begin with the budget development process, but it also falls into a leadership style of hiring competent, talented people who believe in what they do and who are really good at what they do, who are better at it than I am, giving them the room to be able to do the job that they've been hired to do. We pay people a lot of money when we get into central office to do the job that they're expected to do professionally. Provide the guardrails for them to make sure that they're staying in their lane, helping them understand that I'm going to stay in my lane, but I have off-ramps because I'm the superintendent. And I get to ask questions when I see something or smell something that doesn't seem right to me. But it's going to be more questioning about, I don't understand how this is set up. Can you help me explain why this is set up this way? So we go back all the way where I am right now. I can also share my experience in Nashua and Manchester, but as a superintendent, I'd prefer to share my most recent experience. We start in August. We actually start earlier because in June we ask our principals to work with their learning area leaders, which are content directors or department heads, but they don't have any supervisory or authority experience. They just control budgets and curriculum at the school level. We ask them to work through their supply line, and then the schools begin working on developing their budgets, reductions, additions, and so forth. That draft comes to us in August. Our business administrator, our finance director, and assistant finance director sit and work with the principal, the special education coordinator, and any of the other stakeholders that the principal is asked to join them in the budget development process. They begin to work through each line. And we do what's called a student-based budgeting process, which really is looking through the eyes of the student, starting with special education. What's the greatest need that we have to ensure that all students are getting their services? That actually began with our special education coordinators auditing each IEP and attaching a cash value to the services that are in each of those IEPs. That's then calculated into a cumulative number that then goes into the special ed line. And that includes transportation, anything out of district, any specialist, so that 5th grade is talking to 6th grade, 8th grade is talking to 9th grade, so there are no surprises at the middle or high school from students who are moving up that carry a lot of services with them. So that's all planned for. That's our student-based part, and then we begin to build out from there. We look for opportunities to make some efficiency savings. We look for opportunities to increase, to provide more chances to expand programs that are working. We have the evidence that that is working. That's part of that evidence piece. And so that all happens with the principal, their stakeholders, the business administrator, and the assistant business administrator. From there, I get invited, so I get invited to a series of close to 30 meetings inside of 6 weeks with each of the schools that are presenting their budgets. We work through, and I question and ask question, and we either get our pencils out and we start making reductions because we set percentage increases based on where we are in the community, what's happening in terms of, do we have a CBA that's going to be going on that warrant? Do we have a building project that we need to bond for? Are we looking to use unassigned fund balance at the end of the year? And so we want to make sure that not only does our budget work for our students, but taxpayers are going to be able to afford it. So doing all of that, we then bring in the eyes of our community members and ask them, please take a look at what we have proposed. This is the first draft, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, until finally we're able to bring it to our board. We do a budget workshop with our board members. They've had some time to redevelop and ask questions. It becomes their budget. We have a public hearing. People come in and speak to the budget. They ask questions that maybe weren't answered in previous opportunities. It then moves to deliberative session where we present that to the body. People can come up and ask that it be changed by $1 million. There's a vote that's taken whether or not just to blanket reduce our budget by $1 million. It's not happened yet. There have been motions made, but the vote hasn't happened yet. And then it goes on the warrant in March. So the budget process begins in August and really ends on our Super Bowl, which this month was March 14th. And then we start pulling together, all right, so what are we going to do for next year? We turn our attention also to where we are in our budget this year, which has been reported out at every school committee meeting starting in September. We have either our director of finance or our assistant director of finance attend every public school board meeting so that they can answer questions of the public relative to the mechanisms in the budget, as well as report to the board on anything that's going on. She and I meet frequently, multiple times during the school day, either to answer a question, because we have 7 school district budgets that we're working with, and each one is different. We want to make sure that each one is being spent. I tell her, we joke, you're keeping me out of jail. That's your job, Molly. That's what you do. And we ensure that we're living 2 to 3% above the margin by the end of the school year, so we can either do special projects that we've saved for, or we can return it to reduce the tax rate the following November. So we're very conscious about, and I'm very conscious about the money that we're asking people to give us. Totals close to $120 million to educate close to 5,000 students. And so that's a lot of money, and that's a lot of responsibility spread out over 7 different budgets. And then we have our SAU budget as well. And that's a separate budget that's decided on, that we present to the joint board and they approve. The public doesn't vote on that. So very involved with budgeting. A lot of protocols that are in place. We sit through our audit for 2 weeks each year. We meet with Plodzik and Sanderson, who's our CPA. They come in and do a tremendous job. We identify different controls. We really have itemized a lot of our cost centers where we look at program objective and codes. We're really interested in looking at actuals over budgeted and understanding why we either overspent or underspent that line and making corrections in the next year's budget. So we spend an awful lot of time talking about money.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
And your last question. What are the characteristics of the Melrose Public Schools that you find attractive and compelling on the road to your next professional challenge? In other words, why Melrose and why now?
The why now is easy. I really want to be back in a single district, single school committee, hands-on, middle class, committed to the community and the schools kind of place. Melrose fits that to a T. The issues that exist that I've heard about today, and they exist everywhere, but some of the very specific details that were shared with, in one-on-one conversations with people who were just offering up all kinds of information today, are so attractive to me to be able to come and help. I am not the answer man. I don't think any of the three candidates are the answer people. I think that we all have a work style and a leadership style and an energy and a passion to want to do the work here. I know for me, having it here would be special because I'm in a community where my father grew up and spent an awful lot of time, which connects me to him. He's 83 years old, grew up in a foster home, doesn't know his parents. And for me, it's really special to be able to kind of give something back to him and be connected to that in a professional way. And I have a capacity to be able to do that as a superintendent. And I wonder how many other people feel that way about this area, because clearly people love this community. Whomever I speak with that are involved in education throughout the Commonwealth, two things that they say: Melrose, that's a really wonderful community. Melrose, they're doing great work on DEI. Those are two reasons why I would want to come and work here, right off the top. But the issues in talking with school leaders, listening to parents, and the questions that I've been asked are all experiences that I've had, that I've been able to coalesce around and get people to jump in on as a community and want to address and do it together. Not without controversy, certainly not without opposition, but with good, honest work and vulnerability where people are sharing what it is they really believe rather than holding it back, and then moving forward together, even though we're not all going to be 100% satisfied with what we get. I can see that happening here. That's the kind of work that I want to do. That's why I've chosen here and now.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to invite you to make some closing remarks.
They will be brief. I think everybody has had a rather long day. Again, I can't thank you enough for giving me the opportunity to come and spend an entire day with you. I understand that this is a long and difficult process. This is a significant hire for you. Every school personnel hire should be a significant hire for you, but I understand the implications of what it is that you're facing. I think as a school committee, you have done incredible work in not just putting this process together, but really working through the last 3 to 5 years and the transitions that have taken place and addressing the obstacles that you have had to work through and doing it together. I've seen nothing but professionalism and support for your superintendents through those years. That's a school committee that I believe that I would like to work for. That is not as common as we would hope as superintendents, that you would have the support of a school committee that would back the work that people have done in the face of controversy. I believe that my role would be defined over a period of time, and in my entry plan, I would share with you how that role would be defined. It may not be a leadership style that you are used to. It is a walk beside style, not a walk in front of or behind. I like to lead with people to help them develop their skill sets and their capacity, but I'll take a bullet for anybody on any day and step in front if that's what's necessary. My entry plan can really kind of unpack how I would learn more about the people, the culture, the climate, certainly working on the city side, wanting to have an opportunity to meet with police and fire and other key municipal leaders to learn more about what their role is and where they see themselves in the community. I would very much like to be able to come back and have another conversation with you and any member of the public who wishes to converse with me. I certainly hope that I have that opportunity, and I just want to say thank you again for this. This has been a wonderful experience for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we thank you for being here. A very, very long day, starting with your early morning coffee.
Yes.
In Melrose.
Yes.
So we are, again, very grateful for telling us about yourself, telling much of our school community about yourself. And with that, I would invite a motion for a 10-minute recess.
So moved.
Made by Mr. O'Connell, seconded by Mayor Broder. Discussion, seeing none, all in favor? All opposed? That motion carries unanimously with one absent, and we are in recess for 10 minutes.